Georgina Marie. 1. Cass. February 14th. Portland, Oregon. I didn't realize how frigid early mornings could be. Cass surveyed the fallen tree that blocked her path. Snow caught in her eyelashes and the wind whipped the cold through her body, pulling several strands of her blonde hair free. Ears alert, she wasn't about to let herself get caught unawares, and standing there immobile was wasting time. She needed to move. It was an ancient oak, like the rest that still lined the residential street. Because the tree blocked the entire road, there was no easy way to skirt around it. She could try cutting through people's yards. She would still have to dodge the scattered branches, and although the morning was quiet, she was nervous about walking through the front yards of strangers. Daisy growled at the tree. "Easy, girl," Cass muttered. Attempting to clamber over the fallen tree in ice-cold weather with an angsty dog at her side mightn't be the best idea. But she didn't want to lose time and retrace her steps. She sucked in a breath, rubbed her gloved hands over her face, and exhaled. Her mind was spinning, and she questioned her decision to leave. Her apartment was an icebox, but surely that was better than being out in the open, exposed to the elements. What am I doing? Cass glanced down at Daisy, who hugged her side. The stark silence of the early morning, eerie and full of shadows, seemed far more dangerous than the siren's call of her apartment. Daisy tugged on the lead to take the turn that led back home. "Sorry, girl. There's nothing left for us there." She grimaced. "Damn it, Natasha. Did you have to leave me with nothing but your dog?" There. She'd said it out loud. When she got her hands on her former roommate, she was going to wring her neck. A door slamming shut in the distance jolted her away from thoughts of her apartment. She needed to decide. Staring at the first obstacle in her path wasn't getting her any closer to her destination. Lips pursed, Cass tightened the leash and moved to skirt along the vast trunk. It wouldn't be easy, but further along, she could pick her way through the branches that jutted out from the tree. She'd have to tackle the dog first. Her muscles tightened as she lifted a wriggling Daisy and hugged her tightly to her chest. Face full of fur, she used her legs to guide her as she climbed the protruding tree limbs, each foot trying to find a purchase as she blindly scaled the fallen tree. Her body tensed as her boots slid and she gripped the dog even tighter. Daisy whined as Cass heaved her up. Arms extended, she tipped the dog over the icy trunk, dropping her to the other side, and let go of the leash. She heard a low thud as the dog landed. "Shh, Daisy, you're okay. Don't move. I'll be there in a second," she whispered. With her stomach flat against the trunk, Cass hauled herself up, and with a grunt, she swung both her legs and slid over the tree, landing inches away from the whimpering animal. She let out a muffled curse as a stray twig scratched her face, narrowly missing an eye. Daisy wriggled her torso in excitement. Cass patted the dog's head and gave her a biscuit. "There's a good girl." She rubbed both arms to relieve the aching, removed a glove and felt for the wound on her face. Wincing, she pulled a tissue from under her sleeve and dabbed the gash clean. Stuffing the bloody tissue into her pocket, she picked up the leash and gazed along the street. It seemed clear. She glanced up in silent prayer. Progress. At last. As she trudged along, Daisy trotted intently with high steps. Cass sensed several sets of eyes watching her, but kept her head down, trying to ignore them. Portland had never been so quiet. No car horns in the distance, or people scurrying to catch the train into work. Apparently all it took was one afternoon without power to send the people of the city into hiding. Cass understood it, though. Given the riots and chaos she'd witnessed on her way home yesterday, she was sure people were expecting the worst. And the worst was yet to come. With the sky a dark gunmetal gray and the temperature below freezing, a storm was threatening. Behind her, she heard footsteps. She wasn't alone in the early morning streets. Cass quickened her pace. She'd encountered enough of humanity's awful side yesterday and wanted to get away from concentrations of people. Looking over her shoulder, she glimpsed a figure. It darted behind a tree. Was someone following her? Or perhaps it was her imagination? She picked up her steps to a jog, but as her feet slid on the icy path, she slowed her speed. Better safe than sorry. At the end of the street, she stopped and peered behind her. The coast was clear. Whoever it was must have slinked off. He probably just lived in one of the nearby houses. Paranoia was setting in. Time to get a grip. She glanced down at the dog and smiled. I'm being silly. Come on, Daisy girl, let's keep moving. Cass pulled back her shoulders and marched ahead. Her plan was to leave Portland for a few weeks to go stay at her parents' place, at least until everything bounced back. Walking to Meadowview, her tiny hometown just west of Bend, may not be the best idea when there was an ice storm about to pummel the state. With a forested wilderness, hills, and mountains sitting between her and home, even without the ice, it would be a challenging walk. A few years ago, an ice storm had hit Portland, taking out power and dumping ice and snow onto the city overnight. Curled up on the couch with Natasha and every blanket in their apartment, they'd made it through. Cass didn't want to go through that again. Not without power and her best friend to keep her sane. Besides, she'd been meaning to take some time off. It seemed like the universe had decided it was time to visit home and get out of the city for a while. Of course, it would have been an easier journey had her housemate and the boyfriend not stolen all of Cass's good camping gear. It stung, thinking of how easily her friend had turned her back on her and left her to fend for herself. Cass was upset at how little their friendship seemed to mean to Natasha. It meant that now she'd have to brave one of the retail stores between Portland and Meadowview, where the rest of the population would eventually end up panic-buying bread, cans of food, toilet paper, and other random items as they waited for the power to return. Although the wind had picked up, it was too quiet. She'd figured that a few people would have generators whirring away, but there was nothing. Off in the distance, a dog barked, setting Daisy on edge. That was it. And the mysterious owner of the footsteps had disappeared too. It felt like she was back in the countryside where she'd grown up. The thought wasn't as comforting as she'd expected it to be. Not when she didn't know what was going on. She'd seen no flashing lights to indicate the police anywhere nearby, nor had she passed any power company trucks. It was as though she'd been caught in a surreal dream. Voices sent shivers through her body, but Cass grimaced through them as she neared the small crowd that had gathered outside the local Fred Meyer's. She picked up her speed at the sight of the well-known store, her one-stop shop for splurging on delicious food and fuzzy socks. The usually bright neon lights were off, yet Cass still felt the store beckoning to her, calling her into the familiar place she'd spent hours browsing. "Door isn't opening," someone mumbled. Cass's phone was dead. It had been since the previous day, but she was confident that it was at least 7 in the morning. An hour passed when the store should have opened. She stared at the dark building. No familiar sound of a generator whirring away, although that could be because of the noise of the surrounding crowd. It would be strange for a store to turn off a generator, especially with a storm moving in. People would pour in to buy up all the supplies they wouldn't normally even touch. It happened any time the forecast dipped below freezing. "The roads aren't even that icy today," a woman in front of Cass said. Of course, my car chooses today, of all days, to die. Figures. My car died too, the man next to her commented. A few other people in the crowd muttered how they'd also woke to find cars that wouldn't turn over. Another customer looked shell-shocked as she related yesterday's events when she'd witnessed the planes falling out of the sky. This was no coincidence. Cass calmed her shallow breathing as she shoved down the panic that bubbled through her. It'll be fine. The lie didn't work. Her mind continued to spiral with possibilities. Terrorists? But then, how did the power disappear just like that? An EMP? The 3 letters spun in her head. It couldn't be. This was the stuff of movies. This can't be an EMP. Still, she couldn't help but wonder, what if it was? Several minutes passed and the crowd grew, more people complaining about broken-down cars and questioning why the store hadn't opened yet. Today, of all days, it should be open. People needed food and other things to get through the storm. Someone behind Cass snapped. It made her almost laugh to hear the middle-aged woman sound as if she was about to break into a full-blown tantrum, as though she were a toddler being told no. Cass bit her lip and looked away. She didn't want to provoke the woman. The end times. It was the thing her parents had always preached. When society would crumble, and people's dependence on technology and society would be the downfall of humanity. It had always been so ridiculous to Cass that she'd nodded along with them while trying not to roll her eyes. She had tolerated as much of their beliefs shoved down her throat as she could stomach, and the moment she could, she'd left. She'd always wanted to see the world. If it was truly to end, she wanted to have as many experiences, meet as many people, and do as much as she could. Sitting still wasn't in her genes. But she stood there, with the chill biting through her coat and snow falling on a city so unfamiliar to the white powder, it felt like their predictions were coming true. It was no wonder her instincts were to leave Portland far behind. To walk all the way to Meadowview was an insane idea. But it was preferable to sitting around her apartment scared, and with no idea when the power company would get things fixed. If ever. Walking meant that Cass could let her mind wander to other things, like work or how her relationship had crumbled in a blink. It also wasn't like she'd never done it before. When she was a teenager, she'd left her parents' compound. There was only so much end-of-the-world talk she could stomach. She'd packed a backpack and walked. 3 days later, she'd found herself in Eugene. Using a payphone, she'd called her grandma, who lived back in the small town several miles from her parents' house. "I hear you ran away," her grandma had answered the phone. "I did. I'm not coming home. If the world ends, I think I'd rather have done something than sit around and waited," Cass told her. Her grandma had chuckled. "That's a girl after my heart. Now where are you? I'll come get you. You can stay with me until you're ready to face your parents." "What if I never want to see them again?" "Then that's your choice, but there'll be a day when you'll regret that. You shouldn't just go about setting fire to bridges without considering what the future holds. There may be a time that you miss them or want to reach out." Cass had reluctantly told her grandma where she was, and an hour later her grandma's ancient Cadillac had pulled up. On the drive back, they hadn't talked, but Cass knew what she had to do. After a weekend hiding at her grandma's, she'd walked the few miles back to her parents' place. They were mad but proud of her for walking, for not depending on technology. So, at 18, she left for good this time, though she hadn't burned the bridge to her parents. They were crazy, yes, but they were her parents, and she wasn't ready to turn her back on them yet. The crowd jostled around Cass, and she blinked back to the present and bent to ruffle Daisy's ears. Nostalgia had brought a smile to her lips at the memories. She would call in on her grandma before she made it out to her parents' place. Her smile was quick to slide off her face as a man in khakis and a puffy black winter jacket appeared before the locked doors, shivering. He looked nervous as he surveyed the gathered crowd. Hello. My name's Benjamin Howell. I'm the manager here." His voice quivered as people pressed in to hear his words. "It seems the storm not only knocked out our power, but the backup generators are out, too. Unfortunately, we won't be able to open as planned." There was a stony silence. Then, the crowd lost it. People were screaming and cursing at the man. Some people threatened to take legal action. Cass stood stony-faced and rolled her eyes. The crowd was on the verge of losing their grip. She wanted to walk away, to get out while she still could, but that wasn't an option. There was no way she could make it to her family without food and gear. She hadn't been that stupid when she was a teenager, and then it had been a warm late spring day. Cass gritted her teeth as the crowd surged forward. Daisy growled protectively at her feet. It was enough to buy them a little more space from those around them. It wasn't much, but enough that Cass could still breathe. Trapped by the jostling crowd, she wasn't sure what to do. She needed the supplies, but was she willing to see through what she feared was about to happen? People were on edge, and it unnerved her to watch how quickly everything became unraveled. She had little choice as the crowd surged forward. Her eyes darted to her canine companion, who was pressing into her legs for protection. There, Daisy. It'll be all right. I'm here, girl." It wasn't ideal to be traveling with a dog. She couldn't have left her, though. Cass had a soft spot for animals that extended to the ever-so-cute golden retriever puppy her roommate had brought home over a year ago. Cass smiled at the memory, which was immediately replaced with a sharp hurting in the pit of her stomach as she remembered how her so-called best friend and her boyfriend had abandoned them both. For a moment, Cass couldn't help wondering how far they'd got in the cold last night. Cass had barely made it a mile in the few hours since she'd left her apartment, and she was better prepared mentally for the elements than they were, though they had her gear. So they had the upper hand. The store manager stepped out of the way and only mildly protested as the customers quickly turned into a mob as they broke open the doors. People streamed into the dark store, and Cass let them carry her along. Most people headed toward the grocery department, while Cass stepped the opposite way toward the outdoors department. It was eerie being in the store with no lights. In the distance, she heard people shouting as they went about gathering food. Wariness settled around Cass as she walked, using her tiny pocket flashlight to light the way, even though she'd rather let the darkness cling to her. Yesterday's run-in with the men who'd grabbed her had left her tense and on edge. "Keep watch, okay, girl?" Cass whispered to Daisy as they reached the aisles decked out in camping gear. As if she understood, Daisy looked up at Cass with her chocolate-brown eyes, perked her ears, and gave a small wag of her tail. Cass stared at the items on the shelves. What should she do? Does she take only what she could pay for now, or what she knew would make the next few days a little easier? It wasn't like there was a cashier that would ring her up and wish her well. She was already probably breaking a million laws just being here. Cass breathed in through her nostrils, reminded herself that it was okay, and promised that when all this blew over, she'd come back and pay for what she took. For now, she needed to prepare for the storm outside and get to her parents' place. Home had always been a strange concept for Cass. Growing up with prepper parents meant home was never the haven she'd wanted. Her parents were more likely to toss her into the cold, dark woods in the middle of the night to strengthen her skills than to snuggle in and watch Disney movies with her. There was a lot of baggage there that she didn't enjoy delving into. But that was in the past. Now she was a capable adult living the life she had chosen for herself. Years of living in Portland, and Cass was still discovering new things about the city. Sometimes it was exciting and felt like the adventure she'd always longed for. Other times it was exhausting and left her missing the familiarity of where she'd grown up. Home wasn't her end goal, but it would do for the moment. Meadowview would give her some breathing space before she had to plan her next move. Going there was more about getting somewhere she was more familiar with. As much as returning to her parents' place made her skin itch, at least there, she knew how to play their games. "Better the devil I know," Cass muttered. With that, she got busy. All her camping gear had been stolen by her roommate. Cass grabbed a one-person tent and a sleeping bag. Thankfully, Natasha had left the expensive maroon backpack her parents had given her for her Sweet 16. Teenage Cass had been less than thrilled, but adult Cass was thankful as she shoved new supplies into the pack. Cass let her eyes roam over the shelves once more before she turned to face the rest of the store. Several people drifted toward her, giving her wary looks before their eyes slipped to a growling Daisy. Cass gave them a tight smile, her hand patting Daisy's head as they moved out of the aisle. She needed dog and human food and a first aid kit, but she was reluctant to head toward the mass of people. Shouts broke the still air of the dark store. Cass scurried toward the grocery section. People argued, and over stupid things like a bottle of light purple Dawn soap. Cass maneuvered around them as she grabbed a bright pink first aid kit from the shelf. She wasn't surprised to find that most of the practical things like Band-Aids hadn't been touched. Moving deeper into the store, she snatched a handful of granola bars from a smashed box left lying on the floor. Grabbing more things as she dodged frantic people, snatching at items from the shelves, she made it through. Walking toward the front of the store, she spotted the women's clothing section. Cass smiled as she detoured toward it. She could use a new, heavier coat. It rarely got cold in the Pacific Northwest, but the ice outside made her shiver in the coat she had now. A new one wouldn't hurt. As she ran her hand over the faux fur-covered vests, she looked around for something that would be useful. She bypassed the women's and headed straight toward the men's section, where she grabbed a heavy coat. Far more useful compared to the useless things in the women's section. Fashion was out of the window now. Cass was never one who wasted many hours or much money on fashion. Now it was a relief as she ran back to the women's and picked up 2 pairs of black leggings, some jeans, and undergarments, and headed to the dressing rooms. No need to worry about looking cute and adorable when trying to stay warm. Cass pulled on an extra pair of pants before doubling up her shirts for added layers of warmth. What she didn't pull on, she rolled up and stuck into her pack. She then bundled herself into the new, thick vest, not bothering to take the tags off. Outside the dressing room, she could still hear people entering the store. Things were only going to get worse as people panicked. The longer the power companies took to get everything back up, the less organized people would be. She'd been forced to sit through hours of lectures by visiting friends of her parents that would ramble endlessly about how easily one's humanity slipped. Times of strife or struggle were enough to bring out the worst in people. Anything that made their survival instincts kick in meant they stopped looking past themselves and turned inward. Even now, Cass didn't regret not paying more attention. Just a few days, maybe a week or 2, and then things would be back to normal, and she could laugh about her drastic measures like stealing essential clothing from Fred Meyer's. Stepping out of the dressing rooms, Daisy strained at her leash and distracted Cass. She ran straight into a man walking toward her. Stumbling back a step, her eyes flickered with recognition. Smiling down at her was her ex, Nathan. Less than 24 hours since they'd parted ways, and here he was, the last person Cass wanted to see right now, or ever. "Cassandra, I'm so glad I found you." What are you doing here?" Her voice trembled. Probably the same as you. I needed supplies, and I remembered that you'd taken the last of your sweats home, so I thought I'd get you some more, for when you come back home with me." His lips turned upwards as if he'd forced a smile. "It wasn't you behind me, was it?" Cass felt a trickle of ice in her veins at the thought. Daisy chose this moment to bark at the strange man who was standing far too close to her beloved guardian. Cass made a note to give the dog a treat later. Nathan quickly withdrew his hand and glared at the dog. He never was one for pets, which should have been her first red flag. Oh, the things she'd overlooked in the name of love. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Nathan. In case you've forgotten, we broke up. We're done. I suggest you get what you need and head home." Cass moved to edge around him. He reached out again and snatched her bicep, his grip firm. Cass tugged, but he tightened his grip as he pulled her to his side. Daisy's barks were becoming more insistent. The animal knew something was up. Nathan shot the dog a stern stare, then grinned at Cass. Something about him was off. He'd never been a Prince Charming, but there was something new that glinted in his eyes. Cass didn't know what it was, or if she even wanted to know. Suddenly his eyes flitted toward the sound of glass shattering and a group rushing toward them. The jewelry section was just across from the women's clothing. The temptation had been too great. Thankfully, it was just the distraction Cass needed to tear her arm from Nathan's grip. She shoved him away before darting into the crowd. With a pounding heart, she did her best to blend in with the people rushing about, ignoring Nathan's curse and how he screamed her name.
2. Isaac. Who would have expected all this ice? Not me. When he'd set out, he hadn't a destination in mind. His feet had marched, and he was more than content to walk. It wasn't too late to re-enlist, but he wasn't sure the military held his future now. Not anymore, and not after his last tour. Isaac was tired of burying his friends. It was taking too much of a toll on him. He needed something else. His walking had led him into the heart of Portland, where he'd watched the power go out and then planes drop from the sky. It was like a war zone. He'd stepped in to help several civilians that had been hit with debris from one of the plane crashes, and then watched, horrified, as another plane plummeted from the sky. As the confusion and panic spread, he decided he needed to head out of the city, and fast. His grandma lived in a small town down south. He'd be safe there, and he doubted there they'd be as hit by the storm and whatever else was going on in Portland. He wouldn't stay long. He'd get in the way. Sitting around, playing cards, and listening to her old lady gossip about the small town she'd moved to when he'd enlisted at 18 was more than he could stomach. Just the thought of sitting still made him irritable. For the last 10 years, he'd been on the go. Ever since boot camp, his life had been a whirlwind of tours, and what little time he'd got off, that had even been busy with Lillian planning every second of their lives. Isaac wasn't sure he knew how to stay still. Not anymore. He wasn't about to find out either. Walking calmed him, kept the visions of what he'd seen overseas at bay and his emotions under control. There was a checklist in his pack of all the things he was supposed to do now that he was a mere citizen. It would have to wait until power was returned. He couldn't deal with veteran affairs right now, not with his welcome home gift so fresh in his mind. The last thing he needed was a VA-ordered psych to dive into his traumas. His steps slowed as he neared a crowd gathered outside of Fred Meyer's. This wasn't the first time he'd seen the frustrations and desperation. People had been without power for less than a day, and he'd bet his last dollar that the crowd was moments away from descending on the store and wiping it clean. He shifted on his feet, zipped his leather jacket tight to his neck, and moved on. It wasn't a good idea to be in a crowd. Things could get ugly. Isaac was pulled from his mind with a scream. His feet had carried him away from Fred Meyer's, and it took him a moment to reorient himself. It had been so many months since he'd last been home that it took him longer than it should have. To his left, he spotted the source of the scream, a woman with two thugs pinning her to a vehicle. The woman was terrified, and the thugs were laughing. In a blink, Isaac was transported back to Afghanistan. Heat pressed in on him as he swung the scope on his gun about. A woman covered head to toe in black, prayer beads clutched in one hand, stood with her back pressed to the wall of a building. A man was holding something to her throat. A blade? Maybe. It was too far away to see until the sun caught it just right. A blade. Got a civilian held at knife point about 50 meters to the east, Isaac said into the radio on his shoulder. There was a moment of static before his commander's deep voice replied. Stand down, soldier. We're not here to play the hero. You've got a mission to focus on. As the words left his commander's lips, Isaac watched in horror as the man flicked his wrist. The woman dropped. A pool of red swallowed her as he forced his eyes to leave her and focus on the enemy. His grip tightened on his gun. He could have saved her. Just one word and the man would have dropped without knowing what had hit him. Instead, Isaac watched on uselessly as the woman lost her life. Another blink, and Isaac was back on the road outside Portland, ice frosting everything as the soft snow fell. It took several seconds to shake the image out of his head, just one in a slideshow of various moments that would forever eat away at him. Moments he would relive time and time again, every time just as useless as the first. The woman in the present screamed again. Isaac decided to help her when his feet closed the distance. His hands were fisting as he approached. There was a white-hot vein of anger at his core that he sucked up. "Hey," he snapped. The two men glared at him. One had the stupidity of smirking at Isaac, while the other showed some brains by stepping back. Isaac pulled himself to his full height as he eyed the man still pressing the woman into the car. "Let her go." His voice was low and authoritative thanks to a decade of ordering about privates. The man's smirk deepened. "Or what? You gonna kick my butt?" "If it's a fight you're looking for, then you're welcome to it." Isaac spread his arms wide. "Pick on someone your own size, or aren't you man enough?" His taunt worked. The man dropped his hands from the woman and lunged. Years of daily working out and grappling with his fellow Marines had left Isaac ready for any fight. The man turned out to be no real opponent, though, as he tripped and sailed into him and fell flat on his back. Isaac frowned at the man sprawled at his feet. Frustration welled inside him as he reached down and grabbed the man's jacket with both hands, pulling him up on his tiptoes. Isaac didn't let go as he eyeballed the man. "Touch anyone else, and I promise you'll wish I'd dealt with you now. Understood?" The smirk fell from the man's face. Isaac caught a whiff of stale sweat as he dropped him to his feet. He stumbled before running off after his friend, leaving Isaac and the woman alone. Isaac turned his attention to the woman, her back pressed into the car. Unshed tears welled in her eyes. "Are you okay?" Isaac asked. She wiped a tear from her cheek. "Just a little shaken. I've lived here my whole life and never had something like that happen. Guess the weather does mess with people." "People see the power being out as a chance to let their worst sides show. Do you need help getting anywhere?" A tremulous voice whispered, "Thank you. No, I'm fine now." Her gaze flicked over Isaac's shoulder. He figured she must have been on her way to join the crowd outside Fred Meyer's. He wanted to tell her to turn around and go home, that she wouldn't want to be there when things go south. And go south they would. People interested Isaac, but they also always ended up being predictable and doing the worst things. Instead, Isaac's face relaxed. "Good luck, and be safe." "Thanks, you too." The woman hurried off without another glance. Isaac watched her go, heading straight toward the chaos of the store. He massaged his brow with the tips of his fingers. It was no use worrying about her. She'd either have learned a lesson to pay more attention to her surroundings, or she'd forget what happened, believing there would always be a knight in shining armor to save her. Behind him, he heard the squeal of rusty brakes, a sound he hadn't heard since yesterday that caused him to turn. He watched as a gray 1964 Monte Carlo creeped past him, covered in rust spots and in desperate need of some love. But as the only moving car on the road, that didn't matter. It was a sight for sore eyes, and Isaac watched the car disappear around the corner, relieved to have witnessed a moving vehicle. Turning back in the direction he vaguely knew he needed to head, Isaac took a moment to observe his surroundings. From the broken-down cars that littered the oddly quiet street to the dark store windows, he loathed how much this reminded him of his time overseas. There was a wariness in him as he started walking again. He couldn't shake the sensation he was being watched, even though he knew this wasn't the case. Here, back in Oregon, he didn't have to worry about terrorists watching his every move as they'd waited for their chance to attack his convoy. People never understood why he could never relax, and Isaac didn't bother explaining. After what he'd seen during his time in the military, even the most innocent-looking person could have a bomb strapped to them or a loaded gun up their sleeve. He'd witnessed too many guys swept up in pity as they'd tried to help a young child found whimpering in the street, only to get a bullet in the brain as thanks. Maybe he was jaded. Lillian accused him of this when he was last home. Her opinion had never mattered to him, though, and he suspected that's why he wasn't more upset about her cheating on him. Lillian would be the first to argue that he was distant and emotionally unavailable. He wouldn't argue. She might just have a point. Edging around a car that had been turned over on its side, he shoved his hands in his pockets. The miles stretched out before him. There would be plenty of time to dwell on Lillian's words, but right now he needed to put more distance between himself and Portland. His goal was to follow Interstate 5 down to Salem, then take the smaller Highway 22 through the mountains to his grandma's town. He wasn't familiar enough with Oregon, despite growing up there and calling it home, to cut through the wilderness to get there. Roughing it wasn't something he wanted to relive, but now he had no choice. He had enough supplies grabbed from his apartment before he'd stomped out, letting the door slam on Lillian's face. He'd manage. But if worse came to worst, he'd scavenge what he needed. The ice was proving a problem, though. His feet slipped a few times, and the snow had a way of finding its way to the back of his neck, sending a shooting cold down his spine. It was better than the heat, but only just. Is 10 more degrees too much to ask for? With a wry grin, he stepped forward. Just a few days out of the Marines, and he was already going soft.
3. Cass. Cass hunched her shoulders as Daisy pulled on the lead, letting the oversized pup drag her as she quickened her pace. She threw a quick glance over her shoulder and calmed her breathing when she saw he wasn't following her. Her run-in with Nathan shook her more than she'd admit. He'd never been unbalanced before, but Cass would be a liar if she didn't recognize a small part of her was unsurprised. 3 years with him hadn't proved enough for them to grow close. Perhaps it was because Cass preferred to keep her distance and never liked to talk about personal stuff. The last thing she needed was people knowing about her childhood. It always led to questions she wasn't thrilled to answer. Nathan didn't know about her family. Looking back, Cass realized that there'd never been the prospect of a real future with him. He was too possessive. Any guy that even just looked at her usually ended up with Nathan in their face. It had been annoying, but Cass had overlooked it. Heck, she'd even been flattered. Glancing down at Daisy, Cass frowned. Never ignore the red flags, Daisy. They always come back to bite you in the butt. Daisy blinked at Cass and wagged her tail merrily. Cass smiled down at the good-natured golden retriever. Growing up, she'd always begged her parents for a dog. They'd never gotten her one. They'd argued it was too much hassle having to prepare the bunker buried in their backyard. The supplies would take up too much room. Cass had argued that even in the end times, dogs were beneficial. She'd tried reasoning that she could train the dog to find things or to keep strangers away, but her parents had been steadfast in their refusal. "You're a good girl, Daisy." Cass scratched her behind her ears. Daisy flopped around excitedly, getting herself tangled in the leash. Laughing, Cass untangled her. As they left the parking lot, she felt lighter. She planned to head for the highway and make her way south before cutting east. She could cut through the national forests that sit between Portland and her hometown, but with the ice storm bringing down trees, she didn't want to find herself stranded in the middle of nowhere with a tree on top of her. Making it back to the main road, she scanned around. More people were out now that it wasn't so early. Most seemed to make their way towards the store she'd left behind, but some bypassed that for other destinations. It was strange not to hear the constant drone of traffic as she stood on the sidewalk. The silence was eerie and only broken by the occasional cracking of a tree branch giving way under the weight of ice. The sound echoed while sending foreboding chills through Cass's body. It was the sound that drew her from her bed last night, and it was the sound that convinced her that sitting still wasn't something she'd wanted to do. Staying in Portland while the power was out felt too much like tempting fate. Everyone was already on edge after a summer full of protests and butting heads. Without power, things would only get worse, and Cass didn't want to get caught in the crosshairs. No, she'd just do what she was best at. Cass would run away. The thought brought a smile to her face. She remembered how her parents had fought with her when she'd told them she was leaving their compound. They'd accused her of doing what she'd done before, running. Cass didn't see it like that. She hadn't run away then, and she wasn't now. This was just temporary displacement, and motion was something Cass excelled at. When she was working on an article for work, she was always on the go. Just like now, she felt like she was investigating a story about how to flee the city when the crap hit the fan. Anyway, she'd been meaning to leave for several months now, ever since the peaceful city she'd fallen in love with had showed its true colors. A lot like Nathan, Cass sighed as she realized she had terrible taste in not only men, but cities too. "All right, girl, we've got a long walk," Cass told Daisy. At the word walk, Daisy's tail wagged a million miles, and Cass cracked another smile. She was relieved that she wouldn't be making this on-foot journey alone. With Daisy at her side, she might even grasp her sanity. Or at the very least, it would give her someone to talk to as they made their way along. "To the highway," Cass declared. Several blocks from Fred Meyer's, Cass continued to check behind her. Nathan had a habit of turning up out of the blue, and after the way he'd grabbed her earlier, she felt uneasy. It was like she was the item he'd gone into the store for, and he was more than happy to steal her away. The thought was unwelcome, and she shivered. Her steps were cautious as she crossed the road. Old habits had her checking both ways, even though she didn't hear the familiar roar of any engines. Still, getting hit was the last thing she wanted. At the on-ramp to the highway, she stopped. Well, crap. Covered in a thick layer of ice, it looked almost impossible to cross, and Cass wasn't about to twist any ankles. She stalled her steps. Ice skates would have been a great investment, huh? Daisy cocked her head at Cass, her pink tongue lolling out of her mouth. Cass wrinkled her nose as she took in the ice again, although it had melted away in the time her gaze had gone. It was mocking her as a faint shine sparkled in the filtered sunlight. For a heartbeat, Cass entertained the idea of using the ramp as a slide, but noting the few cars left at the bottom, she wasn't about to hazard flinging herself into them. "On to the next ramp," Cass told Daisy. Shooting one last annoyed look at the ramp, she turned to walk away. She heard a scream in the distance, and with the momentary loss of concentration, she hit a patch of ice just right and landed on her tailbone, palms outstretched on the icy asphalt. She dropped Daisy's leash and the dog stared at her for a moment before bouncing off. She stumbled back to her feet. "Daisy, no! Come! Come back!" Losing her balance again, her limbs flailed before she landed on her back. Groaning, she took a moment to stare up at the dark sky. Pulling herself up, Cass took slow, measured steps away from the ice. Daisy, thankfully, had stopped several feet ahead, watching Cass with a look that told the human she was ready to play. Already Cass's backside was sore as she wobbled toward the expectant dog. Daisy barked as her front half lowered to the ground, her play stance. "No plays right now," Cass grumbled. With throbbing palms and a sore backside, Cass stood. On unsteady feet, she took several deep breaths. This was going to be harder than she thought. One glance toward the darkening gray clouds told her the heavens were about to open. She groaned inwardly. Up ahead, Cass watched as several people struggled to shove a car out of the road. There were more people around, hovering by their cars. Rush hour hadn't quite begun yesterday when the power went out, but there was always traffic in Portland. Rain and traffic were so consistent in Portland that after her first year of living there, she'd stopped looking at the traffic app on her phone. It was better to just accept that she'd find herself sitting in traffic than to attempt to plot ways around it. Heat rose to Cass's cheeks as she realized she had an audience to her fall and Daisy's escape. Great. Wiping her free hand on her pants, she saw she was bleeding. She'd barely even begun this journey, and already she was tempted to turn back and ignore her gut screaming at her to leave. The power would be on soon. It had to be, and then she could curl up on the couch with Netflix and sip some wine. Cass's eyes landed on a gas station ahead. Well, at least she could stop there, get cleaned up, and assess the damage away from the chill that pressed in. Heavy snow had begun to fall as she made her way toward the building. She passed a couple arguing next to their car. The wife wanted to walk home, just a few miles, she said, but the husband wasn't about to leave his brand-new car sitting there. Cass bit her tongue. Was a new car more important than seeking shelter? She may have been raised by nuts that thought a fun activity was camping in the woods for 3 weeks straight, but it prepared the family for the inevitable. Yet it had introduced Cass to a love of camping. Her younger sister Charlie had developed a distaste for the great outdoors after that. It was the beginning of the fracture between the sisters. Cass quickly shoved the thought of camping and her sister from her mind. Even without that, Cass would take one look around and know that it was time to abandon their car and head for shelter. Past the arguing couple, there were 3 young women and a man trying to push their minivan off the road. The women looked about 3 seconds from meltdown, like the toddler screaming in the van, but the man was absorbed in his task. Cass was momentarily envious of the man, and even the women. They were working toward something while Cass could barely make it a few miles without bleeding. It had been years since she last sought her parents' approval, but at that moment, tears stung her eyes as she knew how disappointed in her they would be. They didn't waste years of her life training her for situations like this, just for her to throw it all out the window. No, her parents would take one look at her now, shake their heads, and kick her off their property. Peering through the dark windows, Cass noted the destruction in the store. What should she do? Risk it or wait? The vandals were likely long gone. Steeling herself, she stepped through the entrance. While Fred Myers had only just succumbed to the chaos, the gas station had already been trashed. Shelving had been knocked over, soda and energy drinks strewn, their contents oozing onto the floor. Bags of chips and other snacks were crushed. Some had been torn open, but most seemed to have vanished. The cash register had been busted. It was a scene Cass had seen the makings of last night. It was disheartening. Cass's faith in her fellow humans went straight out the door. There was no reason for people to trash a gas station like this. Someone owned the place, and now they'd have to show up to the mess that had been left for them. Cass felt her temper boiling. Good. It was a welcome distraction from the upset and hurt from just moments before. Her anger was a crutch that she welcomed as she strode through the store. At the very back, she found the door to the bathroom hanging from its hinges. There was graffiti on every surface. Of course. Cass dropped her pack to the ground, careful to avoid the suspicious-looking yellow puddle next to the toilet. Choking back her rising nausea, she tried the sink. It bubbled before dying. Cass stared at it for a moment. If the water pumps were down because of the power, this meant no running water anywhere. Did their generators get knocked out too? It was strange how everything seemed to be so utterly destroyed. There were always precautions for emergencies. Backup generators were just one of those. How could Fred Myers and the gas station all have lost their backup power? It was one thing to know that the power was down. That happened. It wasn't the first blackout that had inconvenienced Cass. But this was something more. Something that had her more nervous than before. She finished bandaging her hands. There was nothing to be done about the dull ache in her tailbone. The prospect of walking made her feel miserable, but the realization that there was no running water had her even more eager to leave the city. Stepping from the bathroom, Cass froze. Nathan smiled at her from where he was leaning against the counter. The blood from her face drained and her shoulders tensed. How the hell did he find her? She thought she'd lost him in the chaos of Fred Myers. "Hi, Cassandra," Nathan drawled. "What the hell?" Nathan pouted. "Aren't you happy to see me?" "No, I'm not," Cass snapped. Anger and something else that Cass couldn't identify twisted Nathan's face. Suddenly, he was unrecognizable as he pushed off the counter. Cass stood tall as he approached, despite the trembling hands. She knew Krav Maga. She'd faced down opponents twice his size. There was nothing about him that intimidated her, except for the way his nostrils flared. "I just wanted to talk, Cassandra. Is that so terrible?" Cass scowled at him. "I'm not interested in hearing anything you have to say, okay? We're done, and I'd appreciate it if you stopped stalking me." "You think I'm stalking you?" "Clearly, Nathan. How else do you explain being at Fred Myers and now here?" "Fate, baby. We're destined to be together. You just don't see that yet. But I can help you see it, okay? Just trust me." Cass narrowed her eyes. "Did you do drugs after we broke up? Because this isn't you." She regretted it as soon as the words left her mouth. A vague memory tickled the back of her mind as Nathan continued his approach. His smile was crooked, and his eyes pinched. Was it drugs? Nathan could overindulge in drinking, but he hadn't ever been this, for lack of a better word, creepy toward her before. Cass couldn't shake the feeling that there was a memory she needed to unlock to understand what was happening. "Let's talk. We can go back to my place," Nathan cooed. "No." Cass dodged out of his way and rammed her foot against his calf. He bent to grip his injured leg and let out a curse. Daisy barked frantically, straining at her leash. She launched at him, tearing at a trouser leg. "Get that lunatic animal off of me!" He shook his leg vigorously, but the dog wouldn't let go. Guttural snarls drowned out his cries as Cass tugged at the leash with both hands. "Calm down, Daisy. Calm down, girl," Cass soothed. Suddenly, he pounced forward, kicking Daisy across the floor, which sent her crashing into the pulled-over metal shelving. In an instant, he had Cass flat against the glass of the drink's fridge in a hard embrace. Stale breath washed over her face. She gagged, but as the anger rose, she dipped down and shot up to headbutt him in the jaw. Stunned, he loosened his grip as Cass punched him in the armpit and raced over to the whimpering dog. Ignoring the searing pain in his head, he pulled out a knife from his trouser pocket, stepped forward to the woman who was comforting the dog, and smirked. "Is there A problem here? Came a deep, unfamiliar voice.
4. Isaac. Isaac observed the ice-covered on-ramp to the highway. The cold cut through his leather jacket and he tugged up the collar. It would be too much to have hoped the journey would be an easy one. Still, it was only a minor setback, if even that. The highway had plenty of on-ramps. One of them had to be accessible. He strode on. "Sir?" It took Isaac a moment to realize that the soft voice was directed at him. He glanced to his left to find a young woman with a long braid of white blonde hair peering up at him. She looked nervous, and her gaze kept slipping back to the black minivan behind her. Isaac took it in, realizing that it was old and probably broken down because of its age and the ice. "Do you think you could help?" the woman asked, her voice quiet. "What's the problem?" Isaac asked. The woman flipped her braid off her shoulder. "I picked up my sister and her kids yesterday. The engine cut out while we were on our way to the store. We've not been able to get help. We're stuck and we need to move the car." Isaac glanced at all the other cars that had been abandoned where they'd come to a standstill. The road was clogged with them. He didn't understand why the woman seemed intent on moving hers when no one else had hesitated to leave theirs. "It's my only car," she explained in a rush. "I don't want to risk anything happening before I can come back. Lana and her kids depend on me for rides. I know it's stupid, but I just can't stomach leaving it." "You stayed the night out here?" She tilted her head. "Yeah, there was so much chaos that we thought it would be best to stay put with the kids, but it doesn't look like help is coming, and we can't get through to the police or a tow. So we're going to walk. It's not that far back to my place." The minivan was a piece of crap, but Isaac got that if it was all this woman and her family possessed, then it was worth sticking with it. With the chaos that had unfolded yesterday, he had to hand it to her that she'd stuck it out. It was hard to impress Isaac, but her resolve impressed him. "Okay, I'll help you move it to the side," he said. Thank you, the woman said. "I don't have much, but I can pay you for your services. I hate asking, but you look strong and, well, no one else would stop." Before Isaac could respond, a loud voice from several cars down interrupted. "No, Samantha, absolutely not. Have you lost your mind?" The woman speaking to Isaac flinched before whispering, "They've been shouting all morning and most of the night. He's refusing to leave his car. I guess it's new." Idiot. Isaac tapped his foot. She thrust out her hand. "I'm Lizzie." Isaac reluctantly took it before muttering his name. With that, he let her show him over to the car. She introduced him to her sister, who had her teenage daughter and 3 toddlers curled together under a blanket. "He's going to help us move the car," Lizzie announced. Her sister and teenage daughter jumped out to help. Neither were dressed properly for the frigid temperature that dropped further as the morning progressed. Isaac grimaced as he imagined how rough the previous night would have been for them huddled together. Whatever was going on with the power and the cars, it had hit so unexpectedly that, amazingly, he hadn't witnessed more destruction, though he expected he would come across that when he reached the highway. High speeds and the early rush hour would have resulted in crashes, and phones weren't working. People would be trapped, dying from hypothermia, seriously injured or ill. Isaac was preparing himself to come across a battle zone when he finally reached the highway. "On 3, Isaac announced. Counting down, they heaved the minivan. It didn't move for a moment, then it lurched forward. The going was slow as they put all their might into it. Isaac suspected that there was more wrong with the car than just a dead battery, but he kept this information to himself. In the distance, he heard a dog bark. Glancing up the road, he spotted a woman walking her dog in the ice. Unbelievable. "Nearly there," Lizzie muttered. It took them 5 minutes to push the minivan out of the lane and up onto the curb. Surveying their work, Isaac's attention wandered again to the woman with the dog. She was staring at the gas station across the street. He watched as she crossed the street and entered the store. Just as he was about to turn back to Lizzie, he noticed a man slinking along. Frowning, Isaac stepped away from the minivan. The man crept toward the gas station, peering into the building where the woman had just disappeared. Alarm bells went off, and he was moving before he said goodbye to Lizzie. It didn't matter anyway. She was a stranger who would forget him in a few hours. The woman was being stalked, and Isaac wasn't about to stand by. 10 years in the Marines had taught him to run toward danger, not shy from it. Pulling out his M9 Beretta, Isaac neared the building. Crouching with his back against the concrete wall, he spied into the dark space. Voices reached him. The woman was refusing to leave with the man. Isaac waited to hear the man's response, but there wasn't one. Not wanting to wait any longer, Isaac pulled away from the wall and stepped into the store as he flipped the safety of his gun off. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. The man had staggered to his feet and was moving toward the woman and the dog. He narrowed his eyes at Isaac's interruption. "No," he snapped. Isaac ignored him as he looked at the woman. "He bothering you?" The moment the words left his mouth, Isaac realized he'd wanted her to say yes. Since yesterday, he'd been itching to punch someone. Not usually a violent man, but walking in on his girlfriend of the last 5 years to find she'd shacked up with his best friend had twisted something in him. He hadn't wasted bruised fists on his ex-best buddy, and the punks earlier had been the closest he'd gotten to releasing the anger building up inside him. The man glared, and Isaac raised his eyebrows. She glowered at the man stepping toward her. "Nathan, you were just leaving, right?" "I'm not leaving without you," he snapped. The woman's eyes grew big, and Isaac took this as all the cry for help he'd get. He pelted through the trashed store before the woman had a chance to respond. Yanking the man away from the woman, Isaac dragged him back several steps. The man stuttered as his arms and legs windmilled while he attempted to regain control of his body. "Get off me, asshole," the man grumbled. "Leave," Isaac ordered. "Make me." Isaac grinned. Those were just the words he was hoping to hear. The idiot didn't know what hit him as Isaac hauled him to his feet and dragged him through the gas station. The man was several inches shorter than Isaac and at least 50 pounds lighter. Where Isaac was all muscle, the man was limp arms and flailing legs. Not that it would save him from Isaac's anger. Shoving the man up against the outside wall of the gas station, Isaac crowded the man's personal space. The man sputtered and flailed, but he wasn't going anywhere until Isaac was done with him. Isaac waited for the man's attention to return to him. He was just a weakling set on harassing some woman. A disgusting waste of space. "Leave," Isaac growled, thrilled at the way the man's eyes widened. "Don't even think about following her or anyone else. Pray that you never see me again." Isaac finally released his hold. The man dropped to the ground, then scrambled to his feet, glaring at Isaac the whole time. Isaac watched the man, wondering if he was a bigger idiot than he expected and if he was about to throw a punch. Keeping his eyes locked on the man's eyes, Isaac moved his jacket just slightly to reveal the weapon on his waistband. The man's eyes widened further before he scampered away, slipping on a patch of ice and falling over himself. Isaac watched him sprint away, but then he stopped, turned around, and stared directly back at Isaac, locking eyes. After several seconds, the man mouthed, "She's mine," swept an index finger across his throat, and sneered before he slunk off. Isaac waited a few minutes, then stepped back inside the store and shifted his attention back to the woman. "He's gone," he told her. She flashed her eyes. "Thanks for that, but I had it under control." He blinked as he took in the woman before him. She had her hands on her slim hips as she watched him with deep blue eyes that sparkled despite the darkness of the gas station. Her dirty blonde hair fell from its messy bun as she struggled to get her breathing back under control. "But thank you anyway," she said. "Where are you heading?" Isaac surprised himself at his inquisitiveness. She narrowed her eyes. "Why do you ask?" "I'm not sure that man is done with you. I've seen bastards like him before. They thrive on fear and control. I'd feel better walking you some distance from here." "Thanks, but I don't need a babysitter." Wasn't suggesting that you did, was just offering to give you some company. He watched as she chewed her lower lip. I'm okay, thanks. I got all the company I need with my trusty four-legged friend here. Besides, I'm not staying in the city, so there's no point in following me back to my place. We've a long walk. She reached to stroke Daisy's ears with both hands. The dog tilted her head as if acknowledging Cass's announcement to the stranger. You heading south? He asked. Maybe. I'm heading towards the Bend area. Isaac noticed the way her eyes widened. He wasn't sure if her surprise was because of the distance to Bend or because he'd told her he was walking it. Her face lit up as she rubbed the dog's head again. The dog wagged its tail in happiness. I'm heading that way too, she said. I'm Cassandra, but everyone calls me Cass. This is Daisy. Isaac. I guess it wouldn't hurt sticking together for a while, she said. Isaac shrugged. Might be beneficial, especially with a psycho like that on your tail. While impressed that this woman planned to walk from Portland, he was less than thrilled at the prospect of suddenly having a walking buddy. One look at her told him everything he needed to know. Her coat was new, it still had the tag on it, and there was no way the small pack on her back had enough supplies to last the several days it would take to walk. She wasn't quite helpless, but just about. Isaac wasn't interested in being responsible for anyone other than himself. Lillian was the latest in a long line proving to Isaac why he should stick by himself. She had begged him not to re-enlist, but apparently he'd dragged his feet and she'd grown impatient, or lonely, as she'd protested. Then she'd turned to the warm embrace of another. People either walked away or got in the way, making things messier than they needed to be. This woman fell into the latter category. She's already been stalked, meaning he'd have to be even more hyper-vigilant than usual. But he couldn't leave her alone. She wouldn't last 10 minutes out there without him there to help. It wasn't ideal, but that was life. It was too late now anyway. He didn't have to butt in. She wasn't screaming for help, so maybe she had a handle on things. Whether or not he liked it, he was involved. Shall we go then? Cass asked.
5. Cass. Leaving the gas station behind, Cass clutched Daisy's leash in one hand while the other was balled at her side. She could not believe Nathan's behavior. He'd been acting so weird, and he seemed to see the power being down as a reason to force them back together. She couldn't wrap her head around that. Their breakup had been mostly mutual. Or at least she'd thought that. They'd drifted apart. With her crazy hours spent chasing down leads and securing interviews across Portland, she'd barely had time for a boyfriend. And he worked night shift as an Uber driver. When he wasn't driving, he was usually buried in a video game. The timing was just off, and the spark had long gone. In the end, it had made sense to break up. She dredged through their last few conversations for clues. He'd half-heartedly attempted to talk her out of breaking up, but breakups brought out that side of people. He'd eventually agreed. Their meeting at the coffee shop when the power went out hadn't seemed too out of the ordinary. They'd bickered, and he'd wanted to take her to urgent care for her scrapes. She had to be forceful, but it wasn't out of the way. Looking back, she couldn't quite figure out when he'd changed. Probably the 2 months they'd been apart had been enough time for him to decide it was easier stalking her than finding someone new. He must have followed her from her apartment. She shuddered at the thought. Just a few miles, and then he'd be a distant memory. A lesson to be careful who you date. Cass glanced at the man walking next to her. She couldn't figure him out. He'd offered to walk with her, and yet he seemed reluctant. It had been 20 minutes, and neither had said a word. The snow fell harder now with a chilled wind that hurt her ears, despite the woolen hat that kept her head warm at least. As she tightened her scarf, she shivered as discreetly as she could. There was no way she was going to let her walking companion know she was freezing. It seemed almost too personal. The highway will probably be a disaster, Isaac finally spoke. They'd been searching for an on-ramp that wasn't covered in a thick layer of ice. So far, luck hadn't been on their side. Cass didn't want to admit she was full of doubts. It wasn't too late to flee back to her apartment, but she knew the safest place to be right now would be her parents' place, and she had to keep going. She batted off the negative thoughts. Isaac kept his gaze ahead of them, constantly scanning the horizon. Cass was curious about him, but one flash of annoyance in his pale green eyes was all it took for her questions to evaporate off her tongue. They were walking together, but he'd made it very clear they were not buddies. That was fine with Cass. She'd had enough disasters with men. She couldn't believe Nathan had been following her. What was he thinking? Cass wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. He wanted them back together and to wait out the power outage together. She'd rather have gone with Natasha and her crazy boyfriend. Then at least she knew what she was getting into. It was clear. She'd never really known the man she'd dated for the last 3 years. They passed over a bridge that looked down on the I-5. Cass's steps faltered. Isaac warned her it would be a disaster, but that was an understatement, judging by the sea of cars and the confused people wandering around. Some vehicles had stalled, though most of them had come to a stop in a crash. In some places, cars had been turned over onto their side, and she even saw bodies that weren't moving. As the people below moved around the lifeless bodies, her stomach rolled violently. She pressed a hand to her mouth. "You weren't kidding," she muttered. She was surprised by how many people were still with their vehicles, though with the storm intensifying with each passing hour, she supposed that may be their best option. Getting caught out in the cold would have lethal results. "We should keep moving," Isaac said. Shivering, Cass pushed down her objections. She'd never imagined it would be as bad as this. She'd figured there'd be mangled cars and injured people, but compared to the city, there were far more people walking the highway than out in the city center. Either the two of them weren't the only ones with the thought to get walking, or people had been huddled in their cars for too long. They left the bridge, but Cass couldn't shake the images of the bodies out of her mind. It was only yesterday when she'd been sitting in a coffee shop when a car came flying through the glass front. The driver hadn't made it, but that had felt like an isolated event. Her mind kept whirling as she tried to figure out what was going on. Why no power? And why had all the cars come to a standstill? "It's strange." Her words broke the silence. Isaac worked his jaw, clearly annoyed she couldn't just stay quiet. Cass didn't care. She'd met grumpy men like him before. Everything about him screamed ex-military. Just 2 months ago, she'd chased down a salty ex-army captain for an interview, and Isaac reminded her so much of him. She'd believe it if the two were related, or at least served in the same company. "Don't you find it all strange?" she asked when Isaac didn't offer any input. "Find what strange?" he asked. Cass gestured around them. "All of this. Everything is dead." "How weird is that?" "It's just the storm. Nothing dramatic." "Well, wait a minute. Didn't you see the planes going down? It must be an attack, like maybe a cyber attack that took everything off the grid." Isaac shot her a sharp look. "The on-ramp up there isn't as steep, nor does it look covered in ice, so it's probably our best bet." "Good. Progress at last." Cass paused for a second. "But what are your thoughts?" Isaac looked upward and huffed. "I have no thoughts. It's the storm. Knocked things off. There'll be an explanation." "Yeah, there'll be an explanation. And I'm scared it's far more sinister than a storm." She saw the way he thrust his hands into his coat, and she went back to trudging in silence. They passed a family making their way up the on-ramp. The dad nodded, while the mom pressed her lips in a thin line, watching them make their way onto the highway. Cass waited to hear her opinion, knowing the woman would offer it with no prompting. Sure enough, just as they passed, The woman spoke up. "You're going the wrong way," she said to Cass. "Jillian," her husband hissed. Ignoring him, she said, "It's bad out there. People are getting desperate. Can you believe it's been over 12 hours and no emergency response? Nothing. Unbelievable." "Thanks for the heads up." Cass plastered the cheeriest smile on her face. It was the wrong move, because the woman Jillian narrowed her eyes at them. "Only trouble's waiting for you out there, dear." Cass's smile dropped, and she turned away from the woman. She saw the bags under her eyes. It was undoubtedly a rough night, one that Cass expected she'd be experiencing firsthand when the sun dropped. But she was prepared. Or as prepared as she could be, as images of crashed cars came to mind. "Come on, love. Let them be." The husband gently tugged his wife along. The wife stood her ground for a moment. "Going that way will get you killed, but if you're too stupid to heed my warning, then maybe you deserve it." Cass blinked in surprise at the woman's hostility as she followed her husband. Less than 24 hours and already people were losing their humanity. Cass wished she'd been more surprised, but she wasn't. She couldn't imagine what the family had gone through, driving along the highway when bam, and their car died. It had probably been terrifying. Isaac and Cass moved further along the ramp. Cass was relieved that Daisy seemed unperturbed by everything going on around them, as she was following obediently. Stepping onto the highway, Cass hesitated. Everything about this felt wrong to her, from standing when she'd normally be in a car to the eerie silence. It was like stepping into a horror movie. It had been strange in town, but here, even stranger. The wind whistled through, which put her more on edge, as though there was a killer clown behind her, ready to deliver the fatal blow at any point. Cass turned and looked back at the on-ramp. The family had reached the top and wasn't paying them any attention. "Hey there," came a voice. Next to her, Cass felt Isaac tense. She noted the way his hand went to his belt where she saw the gun. Then, moving her gaze away from it, she took in the older gentleman leaning against the car across from them. Dried blood covered half his head, and his left arm hung at an unnatural angle. Cass shuddered at the thought of how much pain he must be in. "Where's help?" the man asked. "No clue, sir," Isaac replied. The man shifted his feet. His eyes went past them. Cass wanted to help, but she wasn't sure how. Just the sight of the blood on his face had her stomach twisting, and she needed to tear her gaze away. Her eyes landed on the crumpled body of a young man lying on the hood of the car behind the man. Cass gasped before she could catch the words with her free hand. "Oh, God!" she cried. Daisy whined, tugging at the leash to pull her away. Cass tightened her grip as she forced her eyes away from the distressing scene. It was a mistake to think the highway was the best route. She'd rather risk the forests. At least then, she'd be spared the carnage of what had gone wrong yesterday. "We need to keep going," Isaac hissed.
6. Isaac. Isaac took Cass's arm and pulled her away from the injured man. She let him drag her further onto the highway. The snow had begun to stick, blanketing everything in a soft white. It hadn't quite covered the blood from when the cars had stopped without warning. Her heart pounded in her ears as they passed a man slumped against the guardrail. He gurgled blood as he watched them with listless eyes. Further down, two young women clung to each other. One had her leg bent in an odd shape. White bone poked through a bloody, gaping hole. Even Isaac had to look away. Next to her, her friend had glass sticking out of her cheek. Blood oozed out from the wound, although the woman didn't seem to notice. "Holy crap," Cass muttered under her breath. Her eyes jumped around. Bodies lay strewn on snow-covered asphalt. Some showed signs of attempts to revive them. Some were missing their clothing, while others looked oddly peaceful, as though asleep. The dead ones didn't bother Isaac like they did Cass. He knew there would be death here. Everything had come to a screeching halt yesterday. He'd figured the highways would be graveyards in the making, but what he didn't want was the woman at his side to be reacting. "It's not too late to turn around," Isaac said. Over 100 miles of highway stretched to where they were headed. If Cass couldn't stomach this, it was easier if she stayed in Portland. It wasn't advisable, but this woman wasn't able to stomach the darker side of the emergency. And this was just the beginning. There would be more deaths, some brutal, while others would be kindnesses. "No," she wrinkled her forehead. "I don't want to stay in Portland. If the emergency crews haven't reached here yet, that's bad, right?" "Not necessarily," Isaac replied. "Cell phones are down. How else would they know where to go?" "Radios are still a thing." Cass blinked. It was the closest he'd come to revealing his theories. He wouldn't put a voice to them, though, not like Cass, who was unafraid to blurt out her ideas. Isaac had seen plenty of bombs and other weapons while he was serving. Hell, they'd trained him on insane technology that had seemed like a sci-fi writer's wet dream. Things that made him feel like a superhero. But none of them had knocked out the power in vehicles, even airplanes. Everything was down. This couldn't be just a coincidence. This didn't sit well with him. He didn't believe in coincidences. He didn't know what the hell was going on, and with each passing hour, the situation got worse. People were getting desperate. Desperate people did things that put everyone around them in danger. In all his time serving his country overseas, he'd seen nothing like this. It felt more like a terrorist attack, something big, maybe a bomb that had taken out power and cell towers. None of it made any sense. Try as he might, he couldn't logic out what was going on. Terrorism kept pushing into his mind. How many years had they been researching a way to cripple the U.S.? Clenching his jaw, Isaac wrote out the wave of regret that washed over him. He should be with the Marines, getting ready to rain hell down on whoever attacked the U.S. Glancing at the woman at his side, he considered bouncing his ideas off her. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, Cass checked over her shoulder for the 5th time in less than a minute. Would she overreact if he told her? He sensed that her nervousness wouldn't improve. No, it was better to keep his thoughts to himself, at least for now. "It's a slower process, but the National Guard will scramble to get their members alerted and assembled. Then help will be on the way. Until then, people need to decide if they want to stay put and wait, or if they're brave enough to face a long walk." She hesitated before she answered. "I can't stand the sight of blood." Her voice was quiet. He rubbed his stubbled chin. It explained her reaction while further convincing him he needed to persuade her to turn back. He didn't want to be responsible for her. If she couldn't stomach the sight of blood, then she wasn't ready for what lay ahead. Their current situation was just the beginning. It could be weeks, even months without power. "It's going to get worse, Cass." She nodded. I know, but it's one thing knowing and another to face it. I've never seen death so close before." Isaac glanced around them. Death surrounded them. Many lives had been lost yesterday, and there would be more death before everything was said and done. Panic would push people to make wrong decisions. Greed would have neighbors turning on one another. The cold would bite and prove fatal. The death toll would rise. Blood was likely the smallest of everything they'd face, and death would be there, hovering at the edge of their vision, even when they reached her small town. "It's not too late to turn around. No one will think less of you for doing that. It's going to be incredibly tough, the journey ahead." Cass straightened her spine and met his gaze. It surprised him to see the flash of determination. Maybe he'd misjudged her. He'd met a few people in the military who couldn't stomach blood, and yet they'd made fantastic soldiers, able to take down targets a dozen feet away without so much as blinking. It was what would come later when the quiet and dark closed in, when they'd drop to their knees. "I'm not turning around," Cass told him. "I've made it this far. I'll make it back to my parents' place. I'm not a quitter, Isaac. You should know that about me." With that, they continued. People milled about, some looking for ways to leave the highway behind. Others seemed confused and lost, as though they didn't know what to do. Several people approached them. They always asked the same questions. Where's the help? What's happened? Some were mad with anger and confusion. "Unbelievable!" one middle-aged man snapped. Blood stained his suit, and he kept fiddling with the dead cell phone in his hands. His eyes flitted all over the place. The man was about to panic, and Isaac didn't want to be there when it happened. "I pay taxes, you know. That means I'm paying for the police and firefighters, yet I don't see them, don't hear the sirens. This is simply unacceptable." The man walked back to his BMW. Isaac dropped a hand to Cass's back and nudged her along. Eyes watched them as they moved, weaving between stalled and overturned cars. Cass kept her gaze ahead, and Isaac peered into each vehicle. Some were empty. Some held scared people, their eyes wide as they curled into themselves. Few even contained dying people, their injuries from the collisions too severe. "Are you a firefighter?" an elderly woman asked Isaac. She was holding her left arm with her right hand, and there was blood coating the side of her face. One glance behind her, and Isaac saw the crumpled car she must have crawled out from. He stared at her. "No, ma'am." "Are they coming? I keep trying to call, but this damn thing won't place my call." She shook her head at the phone in her hand. "My daughter, she was insistent that I get it, yet what good is it?" "None, ma'am," Isaac replied. Cass looked at the woman with an anxious look on her face. She'd been quiet since admitting she couldn't stomach blood. At first, Isaac had welcomed the silence between them. Now it put him on edge. He also watched as she was continuously looking behind her. The more distance they put between themselves and the gas station, the better. "If you find help, let them know we're here. We're waiting." The elderly woman sighed. "We will, ma'am. It might be best to stay in your car," Isaac said. The woman nodded, but didn't head back to whichever car was hers. Isaac moved around the woman, with Cass trailing behind him and Daisy at her side. Isaac flinched when Cass opened her mouth. He already knew what she was going to say. "We should offer help," Cass said. "I have a first aid kit." "I thought you didn't like blood." Ignoring him, she pushed on. "You must have some medical training. They make you learn that, right?" "They?" She blinked at him before giving him a sheepish look. "Sorry, are you not ex-Army?" "No," he growled. "I'm a Marine." "Oh, so you're on leave?" "No, I'm out. Once a Marine, always a Marine." Her face was expressionless, as though this wasn't the first time she'd heard this. For all Isaac knew, it could have been. She didn't strike him as the type to hang around ex-militaries, though she didn't quite appear the activist, nor the granola type. She wasn't the typical Portland hipster either. He brushed away his thoughts. He didn't like that she intrigued him enough to figure her out. There'd been no figuring out when it had come to Lillian. She'd made everything about herself known loud and clear. "Right," she said. "Anyways, you got trained to provide basic medical help, right?" "We can't stop and help everyone. There's no way either of us has enough supplies." He gestured with his hands. "And even if we stopped for just a few, how would you determine whose life had more value?" Cass opened her mouth before slowly closing it. She hadn't thought of that, but he understood. "It's best to keep moving and avoid getting drawn in," Isaac said. "It's easier that way. Once they see you helping one person, you'll find yourself swarmed, especially as the days without help appear to tick up. Understand?" He'd seen enough fear and uncertainty in his decade as a Marine. He didn't think he'd face even more of it when he returned to the U.S. Cass tilted her head to one side and swept a stray hair from her face. The dog at her side whined and tugged at her leash. Cass whispered in her ear and patted her head. Isaac sensed she'd wanted to argue with him, and he was thankful for the distraction. Crouching down, Cass pulled a water bottle from her pack and poured some out for her thirsty canine companion. Isaac fought the urge to tell her what a waste it was. In a few days, clean drinking water might be scarce, but one glance at the wagging tail had him closing his mouth. He wouldn't be the one to tell Cass that dragging a dog along on a journey like this was a mistake. "Let's go," Isaac said. Cass mock saluted. "You sure you're still not in?" He ignored the comment. She'd softened her words with a smile, but this had little effect as they'd hit their mark. Her face fell, and she shoved the water bottle back into her pack and stood. Isaac knew he'd been rude. She had no way to have known about his exit and the surprise he'd come home to. Still, he wished there wasn't an X in front of Marine. Even if he believed that he'd always be a Marine, he wasn't ready to admit that he hadn't been ready to leave. But leave he did. Because it was what Lillian wanted, demanded. It was her or the Marines. She'd given him the ultimatum. So, like an idiot, he'd chosen her. Too bad she hadn't been willing to wait and had moved on to his best friend. A well-dressed, middle-aged woman approached them. "Do you have food?" "No, ma'am," Isaac said. The woman stepped closer to them. "You sure? I can pay. I have money. Cash even." The woman eyed the bulging packs on both their backs. "Sorry, but there's nothing edible in our packs." Cass's voice was strangled as she went along with Isaac's lie. Isaac glanced at her and she met his gaze. Her face gave her away how desperately she wanted to help the stranger. He was glad they'd had their earlier conversation when they did. The woman coughed. "I'll pay," she repeated, her voice rising. "Sorry, we can't help." Cass edged away from her. Desperation finally overcame the woman and she lunged at Cass. In a blink, she sidestepped the woman. The woman let out a cry of outrage as she turned on Cass again. "Did you just try to attack me?" Cass shouted. Isaac's vision tunneled as he faced the woman. He saw the way the woman's eyes narrowed on Cass. This woman was not done. Isaac stepped toward her. His hands reacted on their own as he reached for her, and he had her pinned against the car before she could protest. She sputtered as he pushed her harder against the car. "Isaac?" Cass touched his shoulder. "Isaac," she repeated. "Calm down. It's okay. You can let her go."
7. Cass. Cass stood motionless as she watched the woman. She'd only wanted food and water. It wasn't her fault. She'd been caught out unprepared. So many people were in the same boat. Her instinct was to help, but Cass understood why they couldn't. The guilt weighed heavily as she turned to face Isaac. She was so focused on him she didn't see the woman's face twist in anguish before she'd lunged at her. Cass easily dodged her, but she tried again. Just as Cass was about to sidestep her again, Isaac grabbed the woman and threw her against the car. "How dare you touch me! I will sue you and ruin your life, you asshole! Let go! Let go!" the woman cried. By now, Daisy was barking frantically while Cass strained to hold on to the leash. Steady, girl." Isaac stared down at the woman, eyes unfocused, panting. It was as if he'd zoned out. It took Cass a moment to piece together what was happening. Her heart went out to him. She moved over to him and laid a hand on his shoulder. Whatever battle was playing out in his mind, he wasn't alone. "Isaac," she whispered. After several seconds, he blinked, and his breathing steadied. Confusion flickered across his face before he looked at the woman in his grasp. Cass watched as the understanding dawned on him, and he was back in the present. For the briefest of moments, she basked in the unfiltered emotions on his face. It was a welcome relief from the robot he'd been all day. She'd take troubled ex-soldier any day to the silent, broody man she'd met. "I'm going to let you go, but you need to listen, or you'll be right back here," Isaac told the woman. She spluttered in indignation. When Isaac didn't move, she huffed, as though she hadn't brought this upon herself. Cass took a step back and glanced around. Eyes were watching them. This wasn't how things should be. Help should be here, helping to keep the peace and ensuring the people had food and warm clothing. "I just want food," the woman said as Isaac led her toward her vehicle. Cass looked at the stranger, observing the way her voice wobbled and how her hand shook as she brushed ice and snow from her front. "I understand, but I can't help you," Isaac told the woman. "Get back in your car and wait, or make your way home." He released her arm. "But you will not come near us again. Do you understand?" Cass watched as the woman climbed into her vehicle, slammed the door, and gave them daggers. "Let's get out of here," Isaac muttered. Silently, they moved through the cars. Cass felt the eyes of their audience boring into the back of her head. Their scrutiny was unwelcome. She wanted to disappear. Did they think she and Isaac were to blame for what happened? Was this the start of desperate people who thought they could just attack them for food and supplies? The last question made Cass quicken her steps. An hour passed before they slowed their steps. They'd put plenty of distance between the woman and themselves, but that hadn't stopped Cass constantly checking behind her. Paranoia was at its height, and it frustrated her. Laughter startled her, and she pulled her gaze from over her shoulder. Ahead of them, she watched some boys kicking around a ball. They giggled as they threw snow at each other and tried to steal the ball away. Daisy pulled at her leash, her eyes alert and interested. Cass smiled warmly. This was the good she needed so desperately to see in people. One glimpse at Isaac and she could tell he felt the same way. Though he'd returned to his quietness from before, at least he gave Cass a grin when he caught her looking. The kids stopped playing with the ball as they saw Daisy and ran over to make a fuss of her. She loved the attention. She was so good with the kids. Cass's heart burst with pride. Cass wanted to stay, to play with them, and let herself forget everything that had gone wrong. This would be good for Daisy, too, but she still wanted more distance from Portland, and more distance from Nathan. "Help, please," came a soft whisper. Isaac stiffened, and Cass turned around, unsure what to expect. A woman stood in yoga pants and a hoodie, her feet bare as she walked through the snow. Cass pressed a hand to her mouth when she saw the glass sticking from one foot. It was a large, jagged piece. Tearing her eyes away from the blood that still flowed from the woman's foot, Cass noticed the bundle in her arms. "Oh," Cass murmured. "Cass," Isaac warned. She took no notice as she moved towards the woman. Tears streamed down the stranger's face as she looked at Cass, clutching the bundle tight to her chest. Cass inched toward her as her heart pounded at the thought of this woman out here with her baby, alone, desperately trying to keep them both alive. "I can't find my husband," the woman hiccuped against a sob. "Cass, there's nothing we can do," Isaac muttered. "There has to be something," Cass frowned. "She has a baby, Isaac, a baby." When Isaac didn't argue, she couldn't help noticing his demeanor. His face was pale, and his eyes were bright as he stared at the bundle in the woman's arms. Cass couldn't understand his behavior. Did he not like babies? "Please help," the woman repeated. "We'll help you find your husband," Cass said. "He was just right here, next to me. I can't find him. Have you seen him?" Cass examined the woman's face. Her eyes were hazy as they darted around, still clutching her bundled baby to her chest. Taking measured steps so as not to spook her, Cass approached the woman. She flinched away from Cass. "No, you can't," the woman said. "She's sleeping. Don't wake her." "It's okay. I won't. What's your name?" "Rosie," the woman replied. "Rosie," Cass smiled. "What a pretty name. She's so precious. How old is she?" Blinking, the woman looked down at her daughter as though she'd momentarily forgotten about her. Fresh anguish hit her, and she let out a heart-shattering moan as she fell to her knees. Cass lunged forward, catching the woman before she fell. "Help me," the woman whispered. Tell me how I can help. I'm here, Cass urged. I need my husband. He'll know what to do. He was supposed to be here. I told him he had to come with us. A shiver overtook the woman, and her grip finally loosened on the baby. She looked down and shook the bundle, as if to waken her. The baby didn't move or make a noise. Cass looked at the child. A strangled sound escaped her. The baby girl was blue, her green eyes staring at nothing. She was dead. Cass looked at Isaac, and he met her eyes as he read the question on her face. Cass moved away from the woman as her stomach lurched. She made it a step before she heaved onto the snow, staining it with the meager contents of her stomach. Tears streaked her face as she failed at wiping them away, while glancing up at the grim expression on Isaac's face. She's dead, Cass said. He nodded. The mom will be too shortly. Cass looked at the woman, who'd curled herself around the baby in the snow. Watching the mother for a moment, she couldn't help feeling so utterly helpless. There must be something we can do, Cass said. Isaac shook his head. It's too late. The woman needs a surgeon and a hospital. She can't die, Isaac. Isaac didn't argue, and that was almost worse than saying nothing. Cass crouched down by the young mother. She was mumbling to herself, and as Cass got closer, she heard the woman repeating the word help over and over. I'm here. Cass laid a hand on the woman's side. Her hand came away sticky with blood. She had to fight hard to keep more bile down. The woman didn't acknowledge Cass as she continued to mumble, her voice growing weaker and weaker. Tears streamed down Cass's face as she sat, stroking her side until the woman took her last breath. Cass couldn't find the energy to move. Finally, Isaac kneeled next to her, hand on her shoulder. Meeting his eyes, he gave her a nod. Wiping her cheeks, Cass let him pull her to her feet. Why? Cass asked. Isaac blinked as though he didn't follow her question. If she was being honest, Cass wasn't even sure what she was asking or what she was hoping to hear him tell her. She just needed to understand how the world could change so suddenly and cause so many innocent lives to get caught up in the middle. I don't know, Isaac finally admitted. Sighing, Cass ran a hand over her face as she struggled to regain her composure. Eyes watched her the whole time, and she felt her frustration welling. Couldn't one of them have helped the woman sooner? We should move, Cass. Isaac took a hold of her arm. Exhaustion pulled on her by late afternoon. Cass wasn't sure how many miles they'd walked, but it wasn't nearly enough. Clear signs of the suburbs that stretched past Portland still surrounded them. We should find a car to claim for the night, Isaac said. Cass glanced up at the sky. There's still light. We can get more miles down. No. Why not? She shot Isaac a glare, annoyed he'd gone and appointed himself the leader of their little excursion. Because you're exhausted. I see the way your feet are dragging. Pushing yourself will only make things worse. We need to stop. Get some rest. The cars are occupied. Not all of them. We'll probably have better luck near an exit, though. People will be more likely to have left their car behind. He had a point. Not every car was full of watching eyes, despite the sensation on the back of her neck telling her they were. They had passed people on foot, too, though they'd been sure to put enough space between them to discourage any conversation. After the encounter with the entitled woman, neither were overly eager for any more chats or confrontations. Still, that hadn't stopped Cass from staring. Some people had coats and boots. Others were in work clothes. A few had on clothing that was so wrong for the weather. One man was stomping through the snow in gym shorts and sandals. Cass had been tempted to offer him something to cover his feet, but she had to bite back the offer. We could leave I-5 behind, she said. You mean go cross-country? He asked. Not quite. We're close to the 205 interchanges, right? Well, we can get off here and take Highway 99 down to Salem, then cut over to Highway 22. Cass watched as Isaac considered this. It was a reasonable option, though not so straightforward. "No, too out of the way," Isaac finally said. Cass rubbed her eyes shut and pried them open. He'd made his mind up, and she wasn't in the mood to argue. Each step she'd taken had weighed on her. Was Nathan still chasing her? Would she make it home or die out here on the highway? She hated how uncertain everything had become. Sleep sounded amazing, but Cass wasn't sure how she felt about breaking into somebody's car. It seemed wrong and way too sketchy for her tastes. She'd rather keep going until they found a hotel or something more legit. Though she realized how unrealistic that sounded. Until the power came back on, she doubted anyone would let them crash at a hotel. "I have a tent," she said. Isaac raised an eyebrow at Cass. She hadn't expected him to be impressed. It wasn't the amazing tent that was now in Natasha's possession, but it was still a better idea than sleeping in a stranger's car, surrounded by all the watching eyes of even more strangers. "Car is a better option." Isaac bent to peer through the window of a stalled vehicle. Cass edged away from him. What if he disturbed someone looking for a fight? They'd come too close to just that earlier, and Cass didn't want it to happen again. Nor did she want to settle into someone's car, only for them to return and kick them out. "I would appreciate your help." Isaac gave her an annoyed look over his shoulder. "There are so many people watching us. This feels so wrong," she muttered under her breath.
8. Isaac. Isaac saw the dark purple circles under her eyes. She was working off too little sleep and her nerves were shot. He'd seen it in soldiers before. It could be a lethal combination that left the soldier making the wrong decision in crunch time. Decisions that could lead to more deaths than necessary. She lowered herself to put both arms around her beloved dog and buried her nose in Daisy's thick coat. Daisy wagged her tail enthusiastically in response. "Look inside the cars," he told her. She looked at Isaac. "No, I don't want to disturb people." He didn't argue. It hit him that he was not the only one struggling with the past's lingering touch. While he still got dragged under the current by the memories of nights he'd do anything to forget, he wondered what monsters lurked in her past. Other than Nathan, who she still hadn't explained, Isaac was increasingly curious about this woman and her past. "There's no one to get upset with you here, Cass." Isaac motioned for her to follow him. She lagged behind him, talking in a low voice to Daisy. The connection with the alert golden retriever seemed to comfort her. They stepped over to a Ford pickup covered with a thick layer of snow. Scraping off the ice from the passenger window and peering into the cab, Isaac shook his head and waited for Cass to respond. When she didn't, they moved to the next car, then another. It took 4 cars before Cass spoke. "I don't get it." "There's no one around." Isaac pointed toward the off-ramp behind them. "I'd bet most of the people here left." "They could come back," she argued. "Unlikely, not while the weather gets worse." Cass shivered as though she'd just realized that the weather had been getting progressively worse. Snow had buried their tracks, and the surrounding cars had thick layers of ice. Isaac was eager to find a suitable vehicle before the ice had sealed the locks. "I've felt eyes on me all afternoon." Cass was staring into the empty Honda and missed the way Isaac's brows furrowed. They'd been mostly alone. Sure, they'd passed people, but there'd been so many deaths. He'd seen the bodies. From the mangled bodies that didn't survive the crashes, to the elderly clutching at their chests, to those that had succumbed to their injuries on the side of the road, death had been their constant companion all afternoon. Some cars still contained the living, or those clinging to life as they bled out or the cold claimed them. Few had crawled out of their ruined cars. Those that couldn't move had curled around themselves next to the cars. Blood had dripped from wounds while their bodies were positioned oddly. Cries of despair and pain had haunted Isaac's every step. He'd assumed this was why Cass had been so quiet. Death wasn't anything new to Isaac. He wondered if this was why he was less affected by it than she was. Cass finally blinked at him, and he shrugged and walked on. Right now wasn't the time or the place. They were too exposed to the elements. The temperature had plummeted in the last few hours, and Isaac worried that tonight would be rough. "You'll have to trust me on this. There's been no one watching us," Isaac told her. "Most are too caught up in themselves to pay us much attention. We're just more idiots braving the cold to them." Cass wrapped her arms around herself as she shivered. Her face revealed her internal conflict, and Isaac was unsure how to proceed. She was a civilian, not one of his men for him to give a pep talk to. She could disagree and walk away. It would be a relief, yet he felt the responsibility. Meeting her gaze, he already knew enough about her. She wasn't one to walk away from anything. "I'm just tired and not thinking straight," Cass said. "It's not like yesterday. Getting home was all adrenaline, and now there's nothing." "That's normal and preferred. You don't want to be running on adrenaline all the time, especially in this situation. I'll find an abandoned car and we can make camp for the evening." Isaac examined several more cars. Peering into one sedan, he saw an elderly couple slumped, their hands melded together. It was touching, yet a reminder of the fragility of life he didn't need. He was concerned about his Grandma Pearl. She was the only family he had left, and she'd never let him down, unlike everyone else. He wasn't sure how he would handle it if she hadn't survived. It was Cass who eventually found a small SUV that was empty and looked relatively clean. Bonus points for the note scrawled on the back of a receipt pinned behind the windshield, stating the owner could be contacted at the number below to reclaim their car when it got towed. It had calmed Cass's fear about anyone returning to their car. "Let's get in," Isaac said. The dog jumped straight through the door Isaac had pried open and made herself comfortable in the passenger seat. Cass managed to smile. Isaac felt relief washing over him. Good. She needed something to take her mind off everything they'd been through so far. Isaac set down his pack before climbing into the back seat. Finally. He slumped in the seat. Cass hesitated for a moment before taking the driver's seat. Silence filled the car as they yanked the doors shut. It wasn't much warmer than outside. They shivered as they stared out the windshield. Out of the corner of his eye, he watched her slow her breathing, and he shifted his attention toward the car. It was clean, and the owner had taken their belongings before leaving, at least the obvious things. Opening the glove box, he shuffled around. "What are you doing?" Cass snapped. "Looking for something useful." "That's stealing, Isaac." He eyed her, and she raised an eyebrow. Clearly, she didn't realize how bad things could get. They needed to be prepared. Whatever the people had left behind in their cars could be the difference between life or death. "We should eat," Cass said. "And Daisy needs feeding." "Yeah," Isaac said. Relieved that she was taking a different route than talking him out of rifling through the glove box, he plucked out a very ripe banana and held it out. "Take it, for energy," he said. Cass took the banana and clambered into the back seat. They made a nest of sorts out of their spare clothing. By the time they'd finished, Daisy had settled down and was snuffling contentedly in the back seat squashed against Cass. Isaac searched for one of the MREs he'd picked up in his haste to grab his stuff and leave the apartment. Cass pulled a bag of chips from her pack and stared at the tuna salad he pulled out. "That looks like cat food." Isaac grinned. She wasn't wrong. It was perhaps the most unappetizing goop of gray he'd ever seen. MREs weren't meant to be gourmet, but some were better than others. Hell, what he would give for a chili mac MRE. It had always been his favorite, the one he was more than willing to trade his desserts to get. Isaac eyed her bag of chips. "It's full of protein and good stuff." "Unlike these, right?" Cass grinned as she popped one into her mouth. "Exactly." But at least mine are delicious and feed my soul." She handed him half of the banana. He shook his head before digging into his food. The car fell quiet as they ate. Daisy snored at her side, and Cass laughed softly, enjoying the warmth of the body heat. "What's the deal with the dog?" he asked. Cass chewed her bottom lip. "Daisy is, well, I guess was, my roommate's. She left her behind. Her psycho boyfriend convinced her to take all my gear and head to some farm west of Beaverton. Your gear? Yeah, I love camping and had all this amazing stuff I'd been saving months and months for. This summer was supposed to be all about camping with my friends. Summer will still come, Cass. She gave him a concentrated look. It was the first time he'd used her name. Sure, but my gear's probably ruined by now. Let's just say her boyfriend is very much a hipster, and I wouldn't be surprised to learn he'd never camped a day in his life. That sucks they stole your stuff. Explains the tag's still on everything. Cass shot him a guilty look. Not ideal, I know, but I figured I needed something to get me from Portland to home. Where is home exactly? You've probably never heard of it. It's a tiny town between Sisters and Bend called Meadowview. Isaac glanced at Cass before slowly admitting, I have heard of it. My grandma Pearl moved there 8 years ago. Pearl? Not the current reigning champion of the Summer Cookie Bake-Off, Pearl? She asked. He shifted to face her. What are the odds? My grandma complained a few times about her nemesis, but also a good friend. Apparently our grandmas have faced off a few times, and yours comes out the winner. Talk about a small world. Cass grinned at him before popping another chip into her mouth and the last chunk of the overripe banana. She's not wrong. Most people had probably never heard of it. It was small, with a population of less than 5,000. Thanks to the hiking spots, though, it was popular with weekend warriors, or so Pearl had complained to him a few months ago. I guess we have the same destination, then, Isaac said after a pause. So, you're heading to your grandma's? Well, I'm looking forward to finally getting to sample her award-winning cookies. I think it's only fair after listening about them for the last few years. Cass beamed at him. He'd already said more than he normally would. He waited for her to ask more questions, to dig more, but she surprised him by falling quiet. A group of middle-aged men walked past their vehicle. One lifted a hand in greeting. Isaac returned the gesture while keeping one eye on Cass. She watched them, her grip on the chip bag turning her knuckles white. I feel so exposed, Cass admitted. I guess that's understandable, he said. Sitting in the car in the middle of the highway, he hated how vulnerable they were. But there was no way around it. Sticking to the highway was their best bet. Especially as a loud crack filled the night air. They turned to watch several trees sagging with the weight of the ice. One large branch finally snapped and fell, taking other branches with it before smashing to the ground. It's too dangerous out there, Isaac told Cass. She paled as she watched more branches break. Is your family in Meadowview? He asked. She dragged her eyes away from the trees. Yeah, my parents live outside, and my grandma lives in a tiny house off the main drag. Do you get back often? No, I'm usually pretty busy with work, and I'm not on the best of terms with my parents. They don't understand why I chose Portland. They hate big cities. I get that. Cass gave him a look before confessing. They're preppers, like doomsday preppers. Completely nuts. I bet they're thriving with the power being out, rubbing it into everyone's faces just how right they were. Isaac wondered why she was headed that way if that was her reaction to her parents. He was curious, but not curious enough to ask her any more personal questions. Her posture had relaxed, so his initial question did its job. The less personal information they shared, the better off they'd be. What's that? Cass squinted out the back window. Turning, Isaac saw smoke rising in the distance. He stared for several seconds before smaller columns of smoke joined it. Somewhere down the highway they'd got fires going. He wasn't sure if this was good or what to make of it. Fires, probably campfires, he said. Cass shivered and Isaac stiffened. It was cold, freezing. As the sun disappeared, it would only get colder. They would have to curl up together to generate enough body heat to keep warm. Isaac wasn't eager to spend the night pressed against a stranger, and even less so to be the one to bring up the subject. We should stay close to each other. Isaac looked away from Cass. For warmth. She finally tore her gaze away from the fires. Slowly, her face transformed into a smirk as she took in just how uncomfortable he was. Are you suggesting that we snuggle up? He shifted uncomfortably. Cass's grin widened and she leaned in. That's the most uninviting offer I've ever had, just so you know. But sure, we can cozy up. I'll be honest, though, you didn't strike me as the cuddling type, she teased. I'm not, he snapped. Her laughter filled the car as she moved closer to Isaac. He grumbled under his breath as she pressed against him, her warmth immediately flooding over him. It was a welcome relief, but he kept this to himself.
9. Cass. February 15th. Lake Oswego region. Cass woke to a dappled light filtering into the car. Blinking the sleep from her eyes, she brought a hand to rub her watery eye. The tip of her nose was icy, dripping, and an unwelcome reminder of the last day. Her entire body groaned as she shifted into a seated position. She didn't know if that was from a day of walking over ice and snow or because of the cold that had snuck into the car. Her body shook from chills. "Cass?" came the sleepy voice next to her. Cass forced a smile as Isaac stared up at her, unimpressed. Her smile slipped, and she turned her attention to the wriggling dog. And the reason she was awake so early. Daisy roughed again before a low whine escaped her. "Daisy needs to go potty." It took her a moment to disengage herself from the nest she and Isaac had made of spare clothing. The moment she shoved open the door, she regretted it. Freezing cold bit into her as she stepped into the early morning. She spotted several smoldering fires down the road from the luckier stranded drivers who'd got a fire going last night before the temperature had plummeted. Daisy jumped down and bounded off toward the grassy median that split the highway. Cass watched the dog sniffing about for a place to do her business, shivering as she disappeared further into her Fred Meyer's coat. She tried thinking of the sun, bright and warm, and when that didn't help, she forced her mind to thoughts of steaming hot chocolate. Nothing would get her blood warm before Daisy returned. The dog wagged her tail, seemingly unaffected by the chill in the air and the heavy snow that was falling. Cass took a moment to glance around. Overnight, the world was dusted in snow and sparkling ice. It was even more of a winter wonderland than yesterday. She didn't appreciate it, though. She'd rather be walking to Meadowview on a warm spring day. The cold had always entered her bones, and it would be months before she shook it. Without a hot shower and even hotter tea on the horizon to warm her, Cass wondered if even the summer could bring warmth back to her body. "We should head out." Isaac's words startled her. Turning, Cass blinked at him. Exhaustion tugged at her. She would kill for more sleep. Last night it was hard for her to get comfortable sandwiched between Isaac and the snuffling dog. When she finally closed her eyes, she'd find them flying open to shouts or tapping on the windows. The constant cracking of tree limbs only added to her growing anxiety. Watching Isaac as he surveyed the relatively quiet highway, Cass kept her lips tight. Complaining wouldn't get her anywhere. She'd already pegged him as a hard ass from his time in the military. "Breakfast, then we hit the road," Cass said. Isaac swung his eyes at her and nodded. He wasn't the best talker. She figured pulling teeth would be easier than getting him to open up. Daisy wagged her tail in eagerness at the promise of food. Cass couldn't help but smile. The dog was so smart. Back in the car, her teeth still chattered as she handed Isaac a granola bar. He glanced at it, shook his head, then downed it in 2 bites. She watched in fascination before nibbling her own cereal bar. They munched in silence as they sat in the car. The last of the warmth from their sleep had evaporated. And Cass felt the cold seeping in. Cass put a handful of kibble into the cup holder for Daisy as she finished her breakfast. The dog devoured the food, wagging her tail in thanks. Cass stroked her velvety ears. She was still beyond pissed Natasha would abandon Daisy, but Cass would rather Daisy be with her than Natasha. Daisy had always felt more like Cass's anyway, ever since she was a puppy. She was the one who scheduled vet appointments, bought her food, and cleaned up her accidents. "My goal is Salem tonight or tomorrow at the latest," Isaac said. "Okay. The sooner we get to Meadowview, the better." I'm tired of being out on the highway and sleeping in other people's cars. He rolled his eyes.
It was one night.
Yeah, well, that's all I need to know. I'm over it. Not as glamorous or as fun as one would think. Cass was rewarded with a rare Isaac grin. It vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. She was glad that she'd grabbed warmer clothing at Fred Meyer's when she did, but even with the layers and her coat, she shivered nonstop as she left the car. Daisy bounded about, happy despite the frigid air and snow. Cass watched her, huddled deeper into her coat, and tightened her scarf, wrapping it over her nose. Oh, what she would give to trade places and not care about the cold. It's weird to see Portland so white, she commented.
Not the first ice and snowstorm we've had.
He turned to face her. Cass snorted. Sure, but when was the last time we had, like a half-foot of snow to wade through here?
It's probably only 4 inches, maybe 5.
Not my point, Cass grumbled as she stomped through the snow. Her shoes crunched on the icy blanket, and with the distant cracks of tree limbs giving into the frozen snow, it was almost enough for her to forget all the other people out there. It was early enough that most people were still holed up in their cars. Cass was conscious of their stares. Maybe even Nathan was out there. Running into him out here wasn't something she wanted to encounter. She hoped he'd taken Isaac's threat to heart and fled back to his apartment. How long were you in the Marines? Cass asked, eager to distract herself from thoughts of her ex-boyfriend. Isaac shot her a glare. He didn't have to answer. Not that she was so interested in getting to know her walking buddy, but talking with him had distracted her yesterday.
2 months off a decade.
That's a long time. Why'd you leave? He worked his jaw as he picked his way around an overturned sedan. Clearly, this was a sensitive subject. It doesn't matter, Cass said. What are your plans now?
Survive.
Exciting. And once you've survived?
Depends on how long we've got left to survive.
He looked away. It took a moment for his words to sink in. Whilst she still didn't know what was going on, she prayed it wasn't anything that drastic. Maybe a few weeks without power. But that was nothing too unusual for bad weather taking out power stations. In less than a month, she'd probably be bribing her sister into driving her back to Portland so she could resume her previous life. Did you always know you wanted to be a Marine?
I guess.
So as a kid, you were the one running around saving the other kids and taking out the bullies?
What's with the questions, Cass?
He barked. Just making conversation, she said, offended. Making a non-committal sound, he turned his attention away from her. All right, silence it is. Her mind was too tired to run wild with ideas, and hopefully she wasn't about to spend another day looking over her shoulder. Nathan must be back in Portland by now. No way was he that obsessed he'd follow her onto a crowded highway full of desperate people while she was traveling with a crabby ex-Marine. Right? Cass distracted herself by watching Daisy's antics. The dog was pouncing on the snow, making happy woofing sounds. No anxiety or stress to be found as she bit at a chunk of ice that had slipped off a car. The distraction worked until Cass heard male voices. Were these familiar voices, or was her mind playing tricks on her? Isaac seemed unaffected, but that was his go-to face. 3 middle-aged men in suits and wool coats stepped around a car. They stopped as they took in Cass and Isaac, businessmen and strangers to Cass. They nodded to Isaac and politely stepped to the side. They were headed north, probably back to their dark apartments in Portland. As their conversation faded, Cass breathed easier. I think most of the tree limbs have fallen, Cass said.
Cutting through the forests is too big of a risk,
Isaac said. Cass narrowed her eyes. I know my way about, plus I'm sure I can avoid the older trees, the ones more likely to rain limbs on top of us. We'll be fine. Better than fine because we won't be out in the open.
You have enough supplies for at least a week spent hiking through the wilderness to Meadowview?
She shrugged. Maybe.
Cass, I'm serious. With me, you're safe. I won't let anyone touch you.
She paused, then slowly met his eyes. I know you think I can't look after myself, but I can. She paused again. But thanks anyway. It helps you're around. Look, I'm tired, and my mind is going a million miles a second. It's nothing personal. Cass went back to stomping through the snow. The once satisfying crunch had lost its appeal. Isaac fell silent as he walked next to her. Silence stretched between them as the miles disappeared. Daisy moved her legs in rhythmical fashion. At regular intervals, she stopped to sniff a car wheel and squatted to pee. The coat she wore kept her insulated, but Cass worried that the dog's paws were getting sore with the constant pounding on the icy road. Most people ignored them, but a few approached them for small talk, asking about the road they'd just traversed, or if they knew anything. "Did you pass any police?" they'd ask. Any word what's going on. And Cass's favorite, "What the hell's going on? Everyone's car's all stopped and nothing seems to work. It wouldn't be so bad sitting out here if only the heater in my car still worked." Cass was checking over her shoulder only every few minutes. It was less than yesterday, an improvement she'd cling to. "We should stop and eat some lunch," Isaac said. Cass was lost in her thoughts of white sands and clear blue waters. They'd been getting her through the walk. Her nose was bright red from the icy air, and her hands were mere icicles attached to her body. As if registering his words in slow motion, she looked at Isaac. "What if I died in the crash, and this is just hell?" she whispered. Isaac frowned as his eyes searched her face. Her words were barely more than gibberish, but she couldn't find the energy to explain better. It was a notion that had been nagging her for the last hour. It could make sense. The car that burst through the windows at the cafe where she'd met Nathan had killed her. It wasn't Nathan that had stalked her to Fred Meyer's in the gas station, just some demon sent to torture her for her sins. The thoughts were so unlike Cass that they startled her. She stopped walking as she took some deep breaths to dislodge the out-of-body feelings. They refused to budge. Growing up, Cass's parents weren't religious, but her mom's parents had been. Her maternal grandma had always ranted about the sins of the world and the demons pulling at her mother's mind, causing her to turn away from the church. When her grandparents had died just before her 10th birthday, she'd wondered if they were finally at peace. Alive, they sure hadn't seemed to find peace. Now Cass couldn't help wondering if she was understanding her grandmother's words. It would sure explain a lot. "We're not dead," Isaac told her. "How can you be so confident?" "Death would have been a more welcome relief than this. Also, I'm not sure what sins I've committed that would get me sent straight to hell." Cass parted her lips to speak, but one look at him had her closing her mouth. There was a strange blankness to his features. She watched him, wondering if her anxiety morphed her face the same way his PTSD did. "I'm sorry," she said. He blinked. Several seconds later, he seemed to return to the present. "Let's eat," he said. "Isaac, I'm sorry. It was just a stupid thought I had. I think I just need a nap or a way to get more sleep tonight." "I get it, Cass." "Yeah, but I'm sorry. I didn't mean to drag up terrible memories for you about things you'd rather forget." "It's fine." It was anything but fine, but Cass didn't push it. Biting her tongue, she watched Isaac. His face was strained from his episode, and guilt hit her. Things were finally going fine between them. They weren't becoming friends or anything crazy like that, but it had been nice to have Isaac more relaxed around her. Her poorly chosen words were enough to send him into the dark depths of his mind and return to being the solemn man. Frustration welled inside her. Cass wanted to blame her exhaustion, but she was worried it was more than that. She'd never paid much attention to her grandmother's ramblings, but despite the passage of time, her words had wormed their way into Cass's mind. Rubbing at her eyes, Cass breathed in a lungful of frigid air. It had been one day. Her parents put her through hell as a kid so that she'd last longer than a day when the crap hit the fan.
10. Isaac. Durham. "Let's eat," Isaac said. "Okay, if you're hungry." He saw the concern in her eyes. He wanted to reassure her it was nothing she'd said. It was just one side effect of the things he'd seen and done overseas, things he'd tried to bury deep inside himself. She had no way of knowing about the woman Isaac had watched blow herself to smithereens. Not every tour had lent itself to seeing the darker side of humanity. It just seemed he attracted it. His tours were always stained with bloodshed and loss. After his second tour, the therapist the VA assigned to him assured him it wasn't his fault. He didn't believe her. From childhood through to the present, wherever Isaac walked, death seemed to follow. The memory had him looking at his walking companion. Her left shoulder reached her ear as she peered back at their tracks. In between the regular checking behind her, she talked softly to Daisy as the dog trotted along. No one was following them. It was a minor relief that most people seemed to have gotten off the highway, and there were fewer people out and about. Cass still jumped whenever she heard voices or spotted people. Isaac wondered if, like him, her paranoia stemmed from real-life experiences that had taught her to always keep an eye out. "What is it you do for a living?" he asked. Startled, she turned to face him. Conversation had never been his strongest point, but it had proven to distract her in the past, something she seemed to need right now. Even Daisy, wagging her tail and occasionally coming over for a little pat, did little to bring Cass into the present. It was enough that he knew that if he didn't act, her pace would slow. They needed to make more progress. "I'm an investigative journalist for a small paper in Portland." "What type of stories do you write?" She furrowed her brow. "It depends. I started doing fluff pieces, like human interest articles. Lately, though, my bosses let me do more interesting stuff. I wrote a piece recently about the city's budget for helping the recovery of wildfire victims from last year." "Interesting," he said, though it didn't sound like something he would read. She shot him a sharp glance. "It was pretty eye-opening. Talking to those who lost their homes was probably some of the hardest interviews I've ever done. The stories of people fleeing their homes and not knowing if they had anything to return to were awful. I was in tears for days after I wrapped those up." "It ended up being an article more about them than the money," Cass admitted with a defeated sigh. "That's a bad thing?" "I don't want to get stuck always writing human interest pieces. There's so much more out there that I want to track down and reveal." "It sounds like you gave these people a voice by sharing their stories. That doesn't sound like a bad thing to me," Isaac told her. Finally, her shoulders relaxed and she smiled. The transformation from stressed and paranoid to relaxed was startling. Cass had an air about her that Isaac could understand why she attracted people willing to tell their stories. It was clear by the way her eyes sparkled she cared about those around her. He said nothing about this to her, though. It would have appeared strange since they barely knew each other. "Did you always want to be a reporter?" She shrugged. "Not really. I was always pulled in a million different directions as a kid with what I wanted to do. It wasn't until I realized that I'm naturally nosy and I enjoy writing that I figured, hey, why not go into journalism?" "You don't strike me as nosy." Cass laughed. "Just you wait. I'll be digging for more personal information before you know it. I'm sure you have some very interesting stories." He felt uncomfortable. The last thing he wanted was for her to learn more about him. It wasn't shame that kept him from sharing his experiences. He'd seen many new recruits that could use some stories to help prepare them for their first tours. Unlike the Marines and other military members that were proud of what they'd done and the evil they'd eliminated, Isaac felt less confident that he was the good guy in all the stories he had. Some of them, sure. He'd saved lives, but he'd also taken them. Worse still, he'd stood by while lives were lost. Those were the stories that haunted him the most. "Are you planning on staying in Meadowview?" Cass asked, pulling him from his thoughts. He frowned before admitting, "I'm not sure." When he'd set out, he didn't have a plan. He'd been meaning to visit Pearl, but staying in the tiny town she hated to love? Isaac wasn't sure he knew how to stand still or put down roots. Being on the go had allowed him to stay a few steps ahead of his ghosts. Meadowview isn't terrible, Cass said. I mean, if you like tiny American towns full of nosy neighbors, guilt-tripping elderly citizens, and a limited selection of shopping. You really know how to sell it. Cass raised her eyebrows. Growing up, it felt so suffocating. Yet here I am, braving the ice and everything else to get back there. I guess the joke's on me. Do you plan on staying there? He asked. Sure, until the power comes back. I was thinking about my parents' compound, but that sounds about as pleasant as staying out here, so I'll probably stay with my grandma in town. He tilted his head sideways. What if it's months before the power comes back? Cass raised her eyebrows. That seems unrealistic. It'll probably be a few weeks at most. I'm sure there are already crews out working on downed power lines or whatever. He was yet to see these crews Cass talked about. Power outages happened, yet if vehicles weren't working, how would the crews get the equipment they needed to the downed substations or lines? Isaac wasn't sure what had knocked everything out, but he knew it was something more sinister than a bad storm. You think crews are out working, right? Cass pushed. Isaac shrugged. Probably. Her eyes widened. There must be. I mean, it's not like they can't fix whatever broke. People will riot in the streets if they have to go too long without power. It may be a few days before they can start, though, and then it depends on the amount of damage. His words trailed off. Yeah, like I said, it may take weeks. Which is annoying, but I've been meaning to use my time off for a while, so whatever. Isaac stared at Cass. Her tone suggested that it wasn't whatever. She seemed annoyed. This didn't surprise him, but she also seemed determined, as though she'd accepted everything that was going on around them. If only he could so easily overlook the evidence that things were far worse than either of them thought. Daisy whined, looking up at the humans with her enormous brown eyes. Cass smiled as she scratched behind the dog's ears, stood in the middle of a sea of dead cars and voices in the distance, just enough to remind him that they weren't alone. Okay, we can stop here and eat, he said. Cass leaned against the nearest car. He wasn't sure if it was an improvement that she didn't bother to look inside it. It was empty, so she wasn't about to get any unwelcome surprises if she looked inside. Most of the cars were empty now. Nearer to the smaller towns around Portland, Isaac figured that people had been close enough to home that it was easier to leave their cars until the weather cleared. Is it bad that I'm already tired of granola bars? Cass asked as she unwrapped one and bit into it. Guess you got no choice. He rolled his eyes as he fished out an apple he'd grabbed from the counter before he'd left the apartment. Other than the bag of tangerines he'd stuffed into his bag, it was the only fresh food he had. For the first time, he wished he'd taken more time to better gather his belongings before he stormed out. He'd let his emotions blind him, and now he felt less prepared than he should have been. He wouldn't be succumbing soon, but had he known what he'd face, he would have been more comfortable. Is that all you have? Isaac asked. Cass rummaged through her pack. Nope, I have half a bag of chips, which you saw me eating last night. I've also got some canned ravioli and chili, which seemed like a good idea. Oh, and I totally forgot that I grabbed some Chewy bars and a box of cereal bars. That's not a terrible selection. Cold ravioli? Cass wrinkled her nose at him. Better than nothing. As he kept a lookout, he leaned on the car across from her. She gave Daisy a handful of kibble. Isaac was impressed that Cass had a giant baggie of dog food and even treats for the dog. She brought out the portable dog water dish. He grinned as she put some snow in it. I got this for hikes this summer. Guess I get to test it out a little early. Thank goodness for Amazon shopping, fueled by too much wine. Cass laughed. He took a bite of the apple. It was a bit too sweet and just a touch on the mushy side. Disappointment hit him as he swallowed. Like everything else from his apartment, it seemed tainted, as though the love that sprouted between Lillian and his best buddy was enough to make everything else Isaac had once enjoyed turn sour. Still, he forced himself to eat it. He knew he sounded dramatic, but he didn't care. Not a fan of apples? Cass asked. Realizing she'd been watching him struggle, he wrinkled his brow. Her eyes were sharp as she stared at him, chewing her granola bar. "What are you doing with that?" He nodded to the tub of Vaseline she'd just pulled from her bag. "It's for Daisy's paws," Cass replied as she showed him the contents. "I remember reading somewhere that it'll help her paws against the cold. I picked it up in the store." Isaac watched in amusement as Daisy flopped about, waiting for Cass's attention. The dog didn't seem to mind the ice and snow. She'd spent most of the day nipping at the snowflakes and wagging her tail, clearly enjoying her long walk. He wished he could enjoy the weather as much as the dog. "Did you serve overseas?" Cass asked, jolting him. His tanned face blanched. He didn't want to answer any more questions on this topic. She looked at him, expressionless, as though she already knew this. To his surprise, a smile blossomed on her face. "I bet the cold's worse for you, right? After all the sun and heat? I can't remember ever being this cold before, but I shouldn't be complaining. It's been months of dreariness leading up to this." Isaac stifled a yawn with the palm of his hand. "Hot or cold is the same. I've learned to ignore discomfort. Makes life easier that way." "I wish I could do that. I'm way too tired, though, to even consider trying to trick my brain into not caring." "Distractions help," Isaac offered. Cass nodded, chewing her bottom lip as she considered his words. Her eyes landed on the license plate behind them, and she jumped up, startling both Isaac and Daisy. The dog let out a yip, while a low curse slipped from Isaac's lips. Did she spot the man from yesterday? He scanned the road behind them, but saw nothing. "Did you ever take road trips as a kid?" Cass asked, oblivious to his reaction. Her face was bright as she waited for his reply. "No," he finally said. A flash of disappointment dimmed her excitement. Cass recovered quickly, waving off his words. "That's fine, we didn't anyways. Once, though, my mom's mom took us on a trip to the beach. Not a very long road trip, but at 11, it sure felt like it. Anyway, we got restless. To distract us, Grandma taught us to play this license plate game." "Okay, what does that have to do with right now?" Isaac asked. "We're on a road trip, Isaac. Look around." Cass opened her arms. "We're surrounded by cars and license plates. To distract us, well, okay, distract me, we can play. It'll make the miles go faster." Hesitantly, Isaac asked, "What does this license plate game consist of?" "Find ascending numbers. So we find a license plate that has a 1, then 2, and 3, and so on. The winner is the person who finds the most consecutive numbers, so keep your eyes peeled and yell them out when you see one. Otherwise, I may swoop in and steal it from you. Got it?" "Okay," he drawled. Cass nodded encouragingly. "I know it's silly, but trust me, it'll make our journey a little more bearable. I guess you don't have to play. I can do it myself." "No, I'll play." Cass beamed at Isaac. While the game sounded ridiculous, he'd take anything to distract her. Her steps had been slow all morning as she'd been constantly on the alert. Talking helped, but Isaac didn't look forward to her more personal questions. There was too much buried in his past for this nosy stranger to go digging up. "Well, I guess I'll start," Cass said. "Gray truck behind you. License plate is HFT 901. Isaac frowned. "That counts? Just because it has the number 1 in it? It would be more challenging if you had to find one with at least 2 numbers. I mean, sure, if you want more of a challenge, but I'm not here for that. Life isn't about working harder, Isaac." He could almost laugh at the sass she threw into her voice. With a shake of his head, he agreed to her rules. If they finished too quickly, he could always challenge her to play his way. It would keep her distracted for hours. Either way, he hoped that this would keep her motivated to move forward and forget about what lurked behind them. "It's your turn to find a 2.
11. Cass, Sherwood. To Cass's relief, Isaac played along with the game. It kept her focus and her mind too busy scanning license plates to worry about anything behind them. He seemed more relaxed now that their conversation had been put on hold. The silence between them was only broken when one of them read out a license plate with the next number. Of course, it only made her more curious. There were stories buried deep within him he wasn't eager to share. For now, she could respect that, even though she was intrigued. Apparently, she was still affected by a handsome if slightly cranky face. She wanted to kick herself. The last handsome man she'd fallen for had been a dude with stalker tendencies. The thought had her going down memory lane of their lackluster relationship, racking her mind for the telltale signs of a stalker in the making. Cass? Blinking, Cass realized that while she'd been caught up in her mind trying to piece together how she'd missed all of Nathan's red flags, her feet had stopped. Standing in the middle of the highway, she heard a family arguing on the other side of the road. Ahead of them, someone was laughing. Peering behind them, Cass thought she saw a flash of a familiar face. Nathan? Her heart froze. It couldn't be. Her eyes were playing tricks. Isaac? She answered through gritted teeth. What's wrong? Cass looked at him, and her words died on her tongue. He looked concerned as he searched her face. Would he believe her? She remembered the previous night. She'd been so convinced that they'd been watched all day, but there was no one there. The thought twisted her stomach as her heart drummed against her ribs. No. This was her imagination. It wasn't Nathan. I think I just need a break, she said. Just as she said that, her eyes landed on a rest stop off the highway. Peeing on the side of the highway while Isaac stared the opposite way had been awful. Cass would give just about anything for just one moment of privacy as she relieved herself. A moment to feel like everything was normal. Or, at least it would be again. Let's stop there, Cass pointed to the rest stop. No. Frowning, she asked, Why? It's full of homeless people, Cass. It's probably filthy, and I doubt there's running water. Isaac noted the look of resistance in Cass's eyes. Look, if you need to pee, there's a patch of trees up ahead. Don't be a snob, Isaac. Homeless people aren't criminals or anything. Didn't say they were. But you acted all high and mighty, which is a surprise. Look, you're probably used to peeing anywhere. It's easier for you, but I'm not. I'd like to use a toilet instead of crouching behind some trees. Isaac sighed. Cass, I understand. It just doesn't look safe or hygienic. I want to just check them out. They might be fine. Let's keep walking, and we could find you somewhere else. Nope, I want to stop here. Hands on her hips, Cass looked him square in his eyes. Fine, but make it quick, Isaac snapped. Thank you. He crossed his arms over his chest as he followed her toward the rest stop. Her steps slowed as she took in how many people were gathered there. Tents and tarps took up what was once the parking lot, creating an obstacle course to the two huts she guessed were the restrooms. It's not too late to turn around, Isaac said. Daisy let out a small whine as though seconding his opinion. Cass didn't want to admit defeat, although she was now having doubts. Thoughts of waking grumpy people and getting stared at made her nervous. Already, eyes had landed on them. Pride submerged her uneasiness. Nope, I'll go check them out. Isaac huffed, and Daisy whined again. Stay here with Daisy. Turning, she flashed Isaac a smile. I don't want people to pet her. She's not the best around strangers, okay? I'll be fine, like 5 minutes tops. If I'm gone longer than that, then you can Liam Neeson or whatever you want and come find me. 3 minutes, Isaac countered. Fine. Lifting his arm, Isaac shoved back his sleeve to look at his watch. Cass stared at it for a moment. It was ornate and looked like an antique. There was obviously a story attached to it. When she met his eyes, he raised an eyebrow and she looked away. Time's ticking, he said. Handing him Daisy's leash and dropping her pack at his feet, Cass suddenly felt exposed. It had taken no time at all for her to have gotten accustomed to her pack on her back and Daisy's leash in hand. She took a deep breath, turned on her heel, and sped walk through the tents. She had to zig and zag because there was no clear path leading to the restrooms. Hey, lady, someone called. Cass kept her eyes locked ahead as she stepped over a sleeping body. Another voice called out to her, but she ignored that as well. With Isaac watching her and the time pressure, she didn't have any spare seconds to waste on talking to the people. Her pace halted as she stepped into the women's restroom. The stench was awful. As though the plumbing hadn't worked in months, but that hadn't stopped people from using the toilets. Saliva filled her mouth as she retched, stumbling back. There was no way she was going to risk touching anything in here. She'd made a mistake. She should have listened to Isaac. The thought whirled through her mind as she spun round and burst out the door. Laughter greeted her. These people knew how disgusting the restrooms were, and they didn't care. Shaking with disgust and nerves, Cass fought to keep her face neutral. She didn't want to antagonize them. With her eyes locked on Isaac, she approached him on shaky legs. She was about to admit just how wrong she was and how stupid stopping had been, but one look at the grim expression on his face had her remaining quiet. He all but shoved her pack and the leash back at her. "We need to leave now," he snapped.
12. Isaac. A look of surprise flashed across Cass's face as she struggled to pull on her pack. As he helped her with the bag, he fought the urge to keep from physically dragging her from there. This had been a mistake, yet he let her have her way. Frustration fueled his pace back to the highway. Cass had to jog to keep up with him, but she didn't utter a word. With her gone, he'd scouted around. His eyes had landed on a familiar figure slinking into the camp. Nathan. He'd been following them. This guy just doesn't give up. Laughter pulled his attention back to Cass, who'd burst out of the restrooms. Even from a distance, he could see how pale she was. Now that they were back on the highway, moving away from the homeless camp, his mind returned to Nathan. He debated telling Cass. She should know, but he worried it would send her over the edge. He was afraid that telling her would only make her more on edge. Realizing this, Isaac kept his sighting from her for now. That didn't mean she had to be defenseless, though. He had a spare handgun in his pack. Not his favorite, just an old handgun he'd kept locked away at the apartment he shared with Lillian. While grabbing his few possessions, he'd shoved it into his pack and forgotten about it. There wasn't any need for it when he had his M9 Beretta at his hip. "Follow me," he said. Cass didn't argue as he led her away from the highway. She just shot one look over her shoulder before they stepped into the woods. Thankfully, this portion of the I-5 had dense woods surrounding it, giving Isaac the perfect place to teach Cass how to hold and shoot the spare gun. He wouldn't tell her why he was giving it to her, and he hoped she didn't push. He just wanted her better prepared should Nathan get the upper hand. "What's up?" Cass asked. Isaac dropped his pack and pulled out his gun. Cass watched with wariness in her eyes. "I think you should be better prepared next time you decide you have to use a rest stop." He grabbed the spare gun and offered it to her. She raised an eyebrow as she stared at the weapon in his hands. He wondered if she was the type to be uncomfortable around firearms. It hadn't occurred to him until just then. Lillian hadn't been the biggest fan, but understood that it was part of his job. She just didn't want to see them in their apartment. "You're going to teach me to fire a gun?" Cass asked slowly. "That's the plan," he said. Cass stared at him for a moment. Something in her gaze gave him pause. He worried for a moment that she was about to protest how she hated guns. They didn't have time for that, not after what had just happened. "Dead center of the tree." She lifted the gun and aimed, hitting her target dead center. "You never mentioned you knew how to shoot." She rolled her eyes at him. "You didn't ask." "You're a damn excellent shot, too." Isaac smiled grudgingly. "Thanks," she shrugged. "I had to learn something to impress my parents. Turns out angsty teenage Cass liked to shoot things out back." "Remind me to never piss you off." "You'd get a warning shot first. I'm not completely unsophisticated." He ignored the quip. "This is for you. It's an old spare of mine. I'd feel better knowing you were armed." "I wasn't in danger at the rest stop," Cass said. Isaac didn't point out how he'd heard her voice waver at the end of her statement. He also didn't mention that she may need to use it against the man following them. He'd have to choose his moment to tell her, and now wasn't the time. "Any other hobbies I should know about?" he asked. "Well, I took some Krav Maga classes, so I could kick your butt with or without the gun." He raised his eyebrows. "Krav Maga?" "Yeah, took like 5 years of it." He let out an impressed whistle. Isaac looked at her with a different perspective. This woman wasn't the delicate thing he'd been treating her as. No, she could probably kick his ass without breaking too much of a sweat. It relieved some of the pressure to keep her safe. "We should get back to the highway," Cass said. She didn't glance over her shoulder once as they headed back toward the road, Isaac trudging behind her.
13. Cass. Wilsonville. Despite the brave words, her mood had slipped. She'd been stupid to think she'd find a moment of normal at the rest stop, but she'd been stubborn and insisted, and where had it gotten her? Absolutely nowhere. Tears pricked her eyes. What if Meadowview was the same? No power, no comforts, and no answers? She just wanted to know what was happening and when it would end. Shivering against the cold, her mind played out a scenario where it was an EMP, and the power never came back on. Would she be able to survive in a world like that? Oh, God, she muttered. Cass? She shook her head at him as her tears finally shed. Her cheeks were damp, but she didn't care. Her parents had always warned her of a world without the modern conveniences she took for granted. A world where people let their desperation lead them on. Where things never seemed to get better. They'd offered her everything to prepare for that future, and she'd laughed at it. And them. Now she was completely unprepared and wasting Isaac's time. Cass, talk to me, Isaac said, his voice gentle as he came to a stop before her. All she could do was shake her head as the fears and worries weighed her down. There weren't words to explain how utterly useless she felt. The universe had tried to prepare her, and she'd ignored it. Her lungs burned as she tried to suck in enough icy air to breathe. Take a deep breath and hold it, Isaac told her. Good. Now let it out. He seemed unfazed by her sudden meltdown. Rubbing her palms hard into her eyes, she collapsed to her knees. Daisy nosed her, whining at her side, but she ignored the dog and Isaac as he crouched before her. How stupid she'd been, and now all she wanted was a steaming hot coffee and to take a scorching shower. Simple things, really. Things she may never have again. Isaac stroked her back as she choked on her fears. She let all of them out through her sobs. She didn't want to find herself trapped in some end-of-days hellscape. Leaving Portland had been stupid. She was stuck out here and didn't know what she was doing. Finally, the sobs let up and her breathing eased. It took her another minute to dry her tears. Isaac watched her, concern etched on his face. Daisy nosed Cass, then flopped in the snow at her feet, belly presented. A small smile pulled at her lips. Standing, Cass brushed the ice and snow off her. I'm better, let's go, she told Isaac, her voice rough and still tear-stained. He stared up at her for a moment. Cass. No, I don't want to talk about it, and I don't want your pity. Let's just forget it happened and get back walking. The rest of the afternoon went by much like the previous day. They passed fewer people, but those they went past either just waved or stopped to ask if they knew anything or had seen any signs of the police. Her head faced forward, Cass occasionally wiped at tears that refused to listen and insisted on falling. It helped to have Isaac's gun tucked into her waistband. They passed the miles by playing the license plate game. She was so focused on marching ahead that she didn't notice when Isaac stopped. Cass almost collided with him, but he turned and caught her before she got a face full of his pack. She muttered a curse under her breath to let out her irritation. What is it? He nodded to a shiny black SUV ahead of them. I think they're stuck inside. Who? Look. Rolling her eyes at him, she turned her attention back to the SUV. Sure enough, the middle-aged man and woman inside had their hands slammed against the steamed-up windows. Even from a distance, she could make out the panic on their faces. Had they been stuck in there since yesterday? We need to help, Cass said. But Isaac was already moving. She scratched her head. This wasn't the man that had been so against helping everyone since their paths had crossed. But then she saw what had prompted him to help. 3 little faces peered out, eyes wide and their cheeks bright red. She picked up her pace and caught up with Isaac as he reached the car. "I'll help," Isaac yelled. The parents stopped banging against the windows. Sagging in their seats, they watched as Isaac searched for something to break the windows. Cass watched the kids for a moment before joining in Isaac's search. Why has no one else helped them? Too worried about saving their own skin to worry about anybody else, Isaac muttered. The hostility in his voice surprised her, but Cass didn't blame him. She felt just as disgusted. "Can we break the windows?" Cass asked. Isaac went still before locking his eyes on the SUV. "I think I have an idea." Cass watched his hands go to his belt as he drew his gun. "Move out of the way," Isaac shouted at them. The mom's eyes widened, but quickly she and her husband clambered into the back of the car. Cass watched the family huddle together in the back seat. She held her breath as Isaac took aim. The gunshot rang out. Isaac was already moving as Cass stared at the shattered window. "Are you okay?" Isaac poked his head into the vehicle. Cass couldn't hear the family's reply, but when he turned around, he had a toddler in his hands. Relief washed over her as she hurried to take the kid so he could grab the next one. Sticky fingers wrapped around her neck. "Hey there," Cass smiled at the kid. Tears spilled down chubby cheeks as the toddler stared at the SUV. Bouncing him on her hip, Cass stepped back as two older kids were pulled from the car. Mom came next. Cass handed over the toddler to the weeping woman. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," the woman said as she pulled her youngest to her chest. Isaac helped the husband avoid the broken glass before jumping to the snow-covered ground. "Just doing the right thing," he mumbled. "Are you guys okay?" Cass asked. "We are now. Thanks to you," the husband said. "I don't know how I'll ever be able to repay you. Guess the car dying took out the locks and we couldn't get the doors open. Thought we were done for." "Charles," his wife hissed before casting a pointed look at their children. He shrugged off her concern before turning back to Isaac. "You saved our skins." "Just glad I could help. Do you guys have a place nearby you could walk to?" Isaac said. Charles nodded. "Yeah, we live not too far from here." "You should get walking then. The sun's going down and you don't want to get caught out here," Isaac told him. The wife sent more thanks their way. Cass smiled at Isaac as he waved it off. She saw how uncomfortable the gratitude made him. Still, he stood a little taller as they watched the family make their way toward home and away from the SUV. "We'd better get moving too," Isaac said. "Okay," Cass said, but she didn't immediately turn to move. Watching the family walk away, she wondered how many other people out there were trapped. A shiver worked its way down her back. It could have been her stuck in a car somewhere. Pushing these thoughts out of her mind, Cass bent to give Daisy a reassuring rub of her soft, floppy ears, then turned to follow Isaac. Her mind was numb as they passed a man, doubled over, blood pooling around him. Several cars down from him, a teenager sat against his car, tears and blood mixing as he hugged himself against the cold and the pain. It had become a familiar sight, one which would haunt her dreams. Not that sleep was easy to come by in the frigid nights. "It's getting dark," Isaac said. It was, but Cass didn't want to be the one to bring it up first. The day had worn on her more than she'd expected. Her body ached, and her nose was raw from the wind. Every step seemed to drain the last of her energy. She felt like someone had run her over and forgot to tell her. "Another night in another stranger's car?" Cass asked. "Unfortunately, yeah." Cass shrugged, unable to muster enough energy to care. Isaac peered into a few vehicles before deciding that the gold Honda CR-V would be their shelter for the night. Daisy leaped into the car, and Cass crawled in after her and relaxed into the seat before reclining it. Sitting was perhaps the single most amazing feeling she'd had in a long time. She never wanted to move again. Maybe she could convince Isaac to drag her the rest of the way. "Food and sleep," she trailed off as her eyes drifted closed. "Are you okay?" Isaac asked. Opening her eyes, she saw him staring at her. She'd shoved her pack into the front seat, but the door was still open, letting snow and cold air blow into the car. Cass yawned. Rest and sustenance were all she needed. In the morning, she'd feel better. "I'll share my tinned ravioli." Cass reached for her pack. "Although, let's get my priorities right. Daisy dog first. She'll be starving, poor thing." She mustered up the energy to yank the door shut. The car was cold, but it was better than the frigid wind that had been cutting into her for the last hours. Snow had fallen heavily throughout the day, and stomping through it had caused her shoes to get wet. Kicking them off, she peeled off her damp socks to reveal blanched, swollen feet. She wrinkled her nostrils as she rubbed them hard with both hands. Sighing in relief as she pulled on a dry pair of socks, she looked over at Isaac. He was doing the same thing in the seat next to her. "I think we should take turns sleeping tonight," Isaac said. Cass's hand was numb with cold as she dug through her pack for the bag of kibble. She wondered why he'd mentioned this now. Perhaps it was because she'd been unable to sleep the previous night. "Okay," Cass said. "I'll take the first watch after dinner," he said. "You don't have to." "I want to." He clearly wasn't in the mood to argue. "Okay. Wake me when it's my turn." Pulling out the kibble and a can of ravioli, she poured out some biscuits for the dog, a bowl of clean water, and placed them both at the front of the vehicle. It was a tight space, but Daisy didn't mind as she gobbled down the biscuits and slurped her water noisily. Cass looked on in amusement as Daisy seemed so oblivious to all the madness going on around them. She popped the top of the can of ravioli with a wry smile. As she stared at the thick tomato sauce, her stomach lurched, and she had to fight back a wave of nausea. Weird. She usually had a stomach of steel. It'd be the exhaustion working against her. "You don't have a fork or spoon, do you?" Cass asked. Isaac shook his head. "Nope. Guess we're having finger food tonight." Cass fished out a stuffed ravioli and plopped it into her mouth. Her stomach revolted, but she ignored the feeling, swallowed, and went for another. She ate 4 before handing the can to Isaac. He looked like he wanted to argue, but took the can from her. Sighing, Cass curled in on herself and closed her eyes. Sleep will help. She suddenly woke and pressed a hand to her mouth. Her stomach rolled again, this time more violently. She was vaguely aware of Isaac next to her, watching her. He may even have asked her something that she didn't hear. She was so focused on keeping the ravioli in her stomach. It was a losing battle. Flinging open the door on her side, she just got her head out of the car before her dinner painted the snow an eerie red-orange color. "Cass?" She pulled the door closed and slumped back. Her body ached and her vision swam as she tried to look at Isaac. He pressed a hand to her forehead. She heard him curse. "You're burning up," he told her. She nodded before her stomach twisted, and she lunged toward the door again. The way the sauce splattered the snow, it looked more like she was vomiting blood instead of bad ravioli. Snow whipped around her head as she stared at the tainted snow. But she didn't even notice. Her vision faded to black.
Epilogue. Nathan. Nathan watched as Cass had scurried off with the stranger, the man that had interrupted their conversation and shoved him around. Did she not see what an asshole this man was? She'd always been so level-headed, but clearly she wasn't thinking straight. Why couldn't she see he was trying to help? He'd only wanted to make sure she was okay. With him at her side, she wouldn't be making such reckless decisions. She loved him. She just didn't know it yet. He saw the way her eyes had widened when he approached her. She'd always loved the chase. It was all just a part of the dance. True love didn't stop just because of separation or the snow. He'd been going about this all wrong. Cassandra was unlike any other woman he'd met. She was smart, beautiful, and funny. From the moment she'd agreed to a date, he knew she was the only woman he would ever need. Dating Cassandra had taught him that for him to be on her level, he would have to let her have more freedom than he liked. But once he worked out her boundaries, he could reel in the leash. Breaking up had been part of his plan. He'd meant it for Cassandra to realize how empty her life was without him in it. She would be back in a few weeks, begging him to get back together. The car crashing into the cafe and the world going dark had thrown a wrench into his plans. He'd planned to remind her they were great together. He'd given her space, supported her strange ideas, and all the odd things she loved. She just needed to be reminded of this. But she wouldn't need these things when she was by his side. He would love her and treat her like the goddess she was. She would never want for or need anything. It might take some work to get her to see this. Cassandra was a challenge he thrived on conquering. There had been times when he'd grown impatient and frustrated. But it would all be worth it in the end, when she was his, and only his. The darkness falling over the city should have had Cassandra eager to stand by him. Together, they would return to his home, the apartment he'd been getting ready for when she agreed to move in. Yet she disappeared. People had been bloodied and screaming, and she'd ran straight into the madness. But that was Cassandra. It terrified him. He'd seen the blood running down her face and feared she'd leave him before he could make her his. It had accelerated his need to make her understand he just wanted to love and protect her. The world was not a kind place, yet Cassandra seemed to have forgotten this. She deluded herself she was content living away from him, doing her own thing, and not letting him protect her. Now she would understand. He had known she wanted to leave Portland. She'd never liked to sit still for long. It was frustrating, but he understood that perfection was overrated. His woman had several flaws he would have to work on, like his mom. He'd watched countless times how his mother had suffered at the hands of her pimp, beating her until she begged him to stop. But in the end, she'd learned. Nathan was different. He wanted to meld Cassandra with love, not with his fists. He'd been misled by a beauty that had turned out to be a snake in disguise. When she tried to leave, instead of letting her go, he let his rage blind him. It had terrified him when he came back and saw her blood staining his carpet. The carpet he'd chosen because she said soft pink was her favorite. He had feared there was no woman out there for him. Then he met Cassandra. Nothing else had mattered the moment he laid eyes on her. He'd watched as Cass had disappeared into the ice and snow with the stranger. Determined, Nathan moved from the shadows. She was scared. She couldn't see he was trying to help her, but he needed to be patient a little longer. Let her go with this stranger. She would see the error of her ways, and when she did, he'd be there to help her, to save her.